"The shed is all you deserve," Travis said. He said it in the farmhouse kitchen, with his father's coffee cup still hanging from a hook above the sink. Margaret Cole looked at her son across the table. Travis had brought a folder, 2 pens, and a woman from the estate office who had already explained 3 times that she wasn't there to give anyone personal advice. Rachel sat beside him with her calculator and a neat stack of account statements. Nobody had taken off a coat. Outside, rain tapped against the windows of the farmhouse at 18 Parker Road. Beyond the back field stood the contracting yard Travis had managed since Frank got sick. 2 dump trailers, a skid steer, and a row of wrapped drainage pipes sat behind a chain-link fence. Travis could see them from his chair. He kept glancing that way as if someone might take them while he was inside. Margaret had lived in that house for 37 years. That morning, her place at the kitchen table felt borrowed. She was 68, a year widowed, and tired of people lowering their voices around her. Frank had died the previous spring. Since then, Travis and Rachel had spoken about the farm company, the house, and the accounts as if Margaret were a chair they had to work around. The woman from the estate office turned one page toward her. This agreement assigns the residence and the operating yard to Travis under the family settlement. Rachel receives the remaining liquid estate accounts after expenses. Mrs. Cole receives the Parker Road outbuilding identified as the former feed shed, together with its contents and the parcel immediately surrounding it. "Parcel," Margaret said. "How much ground?" Rachel answered before the woman could. "Just under half an acre. The survey pins are already there. You ordered a survey? We needed one for the settlement." "We?" Rachel pressed her lips together. She had been a bookkeeper long enough to make silence sound like a correction. Travis leaned back. "Mom, we've been through this." They hadn't. They had been around it, under it, and past it. Travis had called decisions temporary until the papers were ready. Rachel had called them necessary. Every conversation had ended when Margaret asked who had decided what. She rested one hand on the folder. Her right shoulder ached from carrying boxes down from the bedroom. Travis had told her she could leave personal things in the hall until Friday. Friday was when a cleaning crew would come through before he moved into the farmhouse. "Where am I supposed to live?" she asked. Rachel's eyes moved toward the rain-dark window. Travis rubbed the side of his jaw. "You said Irene offered you her spare room? For 2 weeks. That gives you time. For what? To find something suitable." Margaret looked at him. As a boy, Travis had never been able to lie without touching his face. At 44, he still couldn't. The estate woman cleared her throat. "Housing arrangements aren't part of the agreement." "No," Margaret said. "Apparently not." Rachel pushed another sheet across the table. "The shed has value, Mom. Not much, but it's yours outright. You can sell it back to the company, and then you'll have money for a deposit somewhere. How much?" "We haven't set that yet." "You had it surveyed without setting a value?" "It's a feed shed," Travis said. "The roof leaks. Half the floor is bad. There's no proper plumbing, no heat, and the power was disconnected years ago." Margaret knew the building. It stood beyond the old pear trees at the edge of the former livestock field. Frank had kept feed there when they still raised laying hens. Later, he had used the back half for storage. Margaret had gone inside only a few times during his final years. The door dragged. The roof dipped over the north wall. There were fixed wooden bins along one side and old shelves along the other. "You want it?" she said. "I want the land cleaned up. You want the company to own an unbroken strip from the road to the drainage ditch." Travis gave Rachel a quick look. That was answer enough. He had been speaking with a developer from Manahawkin. Margaret knew that because the man had left a business card beside the farmhouse telephone. Travis had pocketed it when he saw her reading the name. "This is exactly why we need to finish," he said. "Everything turns into an accusation." Margaret opened the folder. The first pages listed properties she already understood. The farmhouse was valued with the yard because both sat under the farm company's operating agreement. Frank had transferred voting control to Travis and Rachel when his health failed. Margaret had agreed at the time. She'd believed control meant they could keep the business running while Frank underwent treatment. She hadn't understood that running it and deciding its future would become the same thing. The liquid accounts weren't the large fortune Rachel's careful posture suggested. There was enough to matter and enough to disappear quickly once expenses were paid. Rachel wanted closure because a lender was reviewing her mortgage application. She hadn't told Margaret that herself. Travis had let it slip during an argument in the driveway. Margaret turned to the property schedule. The feed shed was described by location, approximate size, and condition. A line beneath it assigned $16,000 in delinquent property taxes to whoever accepted the parcel. She read it twice. How long? Rachel reached for the calculator, though no calculation was needed. 45 days before the county starts the next enforcement step. You knew about this. We all knew taxes were behind. I knew the company had tax bills. I didn't know you separated this parcel with $16,000 attached to it. Travis pushed away from the table. You're getting the building and everything in it. We're not asking you to pay our bills. You put the bill where you put me. The estate woman studied the clasp on her bag. Rachel spoke softly. The accounts have to be divided cleanly. There wasn't another practical way. There's always another practical way. People just don't like the price. Margaret had spent most of her working life building cabinets. She knew what happened when someone said a crooked wall left them no choice. It usually meant they wanted the doors installed before lunch. There were choices. Some took longer, some cost more, some required admitting the first measurement had been wrong. Travis stood and walked to the sink. He looked broad in Frank's kitchen, though not comfortable. Dad wanted the company kept together. Did he? You know he did. What I know is that he wanted you working. Those aren't the same thing. Rachel closed her calculator cover. Can we please not turn this into a trial about Dad? The agreement is ready. If Mom signs, everyone can move ahead. Margaret looked down again. On the last page, beneath the property description, one sentence had been copied from Frank's will. It granted her the feed shed and every item housed within or beneath its fixtures. The wording sounded like frank, exact, slightly awkward, and more concerned with objects than feelings. A fixture in his mind wasn't merely something attached to a wall. He used the word for benches, racks, bins, and anything he had fastened so securely that another man would curse while removing it. Margaret touched the sentence with her finger. What's in there now? Junk, Travis said. Rachel said. Old farm supplies. Arthur Barnes has tools in the back. Travis turned from the sink. Then Arthur can collect them. Have you told him that? No. Has anyone made an inventory? Rachel shuffled through her pages. There was a general inspection. By whom? The surveyor looked through the doorway. That isn't an inventory. Travis let out a breath. Mom, if there were anything worth selling, Dad would have sold it. You know how tight things got. Margaret did know. During Frank's last illness, bills arrived faster than he could open them. He sold a boat trailer, 2 engines, and a stack of cedar planks he had kept dry for years. He never mentioned selling anything from the feed shed. She remembered him carrying a small oil can out there one October morning. He had been thin by then, his work trousers cinched with a belt punched through an extra hole. She offered to go with him. He told her he only needed to check on something before the weather changed. At the time, she believed he meant Arthur's tools. Now she wasn't sure. Travis returned to the table and tapped the signature line. This doesn't need to be harder than it is. Sign the settlement. Then sign a quitclaim so we can fold that little parcel back into the main property. I'll deal with the taxes. For nothing? I didn't say that. You didn't say an amount. We'll work it out. Margaret almost smiled. Frank had used that phrase whenever a machine needed parts he couldn't afford. It meant he had no answer yet. From Travis, it meant he wanted her signature before he gave one. Rachel leaned toward her. If you don't sign today, the account distribution gets held up again. There it is, Margaret said. What? The hurry. Rachel's face colored. My mortgage isn't the only reason. No. Travis has his land buyer too. He isn't my land buyer, Travis said. Margaret waited. Travis picked up one of the pens and set it down again. There have been conversations, that's all. With someone who needs the shed parcel included. It would make access easier. So the shed has no value, but the land under it makes access easier. That doesn't make the building good. No, it makes your offer incomplete. For the first time in the morning, the estate woman looked directly at Margaret. She didn't smile. She simply moved the unsigned quitclaim away from the settlement papers, separating the two documents by the width of her hand. Margaret noticed. The family settlement and the quitclaim were not the same thing. Travis had placed them together as if one required the other. That was her tiny piece of solid ground. Mrs. Cole, the woman said, you may accept the settlement without transferring the parcel afterward. The quitclaim is a separate voluntary document. Travis's chair scraped the floor. Nobody said otherwise. You put both pens on top of both papers, Margaret said. They're pens, Mom. And these are papers. I still know the difference." Rachel stared at her brother. She hadn't known he was presenting the quitclaim that way. Margaret could see it in the quick tightening around her mouth. Rachel wanted her money released. She did not want another surprise tied to it. Margaret read the settlement once more. Refusing it would not return the farmhouse to her. The company arrangement had already placed that fight on ground. She couldn't afford to hold. She had a modest savings account in her own name, the tools she had kept after retiring, her clothes, her car, and now the shed if she accepted it. The taxes were cruel, but they were plain. Plain trouble could be measured. She signed the family settlement. Rachel's shoulders dropped. Travis immediately slid the quitclaim toward her. Margaret capped the pen. "No, Mom. You said the shed is all I deserve. I heard you. I was angry. You were prepared." He looked toward the estate woman, but she had begun placing the completed settlement into her case. Margaret gathered her copy. She also took the property schedule and the page containing Frank's exact language. Travis put one palm flat on the quitclaim. "What are you going to do with a falling down feed shed?" "I'm going to look inside before I give it to you. There's nothing to look at. Then waiting won't hurt you. It will if the county moves on the taxes. I have 45 days. You have no water there, no power. You can't stay in it. I didn't say I could. Then be reasonable." Margaret stood. Her knees were stiff after the long meeting, and she waited for them to settle before lifting her handbag. She didn't hide the pause. Travis mistook speed for strength, just as he mistook pressure for agreement. "Where's the key?" she asked. He glanced at Rachel. Rachel looked down at the papers. Dad's ring was in the kitchen drawer. Travis opened the drawer beside the refrigerator. He moved takeout menus, rubber bands, and 2 dead batteries. At the back lay Frank's heavy brass keyring. He lifted it, then hesitated. Margaret held out her hand. "The shed key may not even work," he said. "I'll find out." He dropped the ring into her palm. The keys struck one another with the familiar dull chime she had heard at Frank's belt for most of their marriage. Margaret slipped them into her handbag. She went upstairs while Travis and Rachel continued talking below. They kept their voices low, which made every word easier to hear through the old heating vent. Travis said she was being stubborn. Rachel said he should never have brought the quitclaim to the meeting. He told her not to start. Rachel told him she was already in it. Margaret packed 2 work shirts, jeans, underclothes, medicine, toiletries, Frank's wool blanket, and a framed photograph from the dresser. She left the large suitcase in the closet and chose the small brown one with working wheels. A person carried differently when she didn't know where she would sleep. In the garage, she found her carpenter's level behind a box of holiday lights. Travis had overlooked it because the yellow casing was stained, and one end had been repaired with black tape. Margaret checked the bubble. It was true. She added a tape measure, gloves, a pry bar, and a flashlight. When she came back through the kitchen, Rachel was alone at the table. "Mom, Irene's expecting you tonight." "I'll call her." "You're not going to sleep in that shed?" "I'm going to see whether it can keep the rain out." "It can't." "Then that's the first useful thing I'll learn." Rachel's eyes went to the suitcase. For one moment, she looked less like the family bookkeeper and more like Margaret's daughter. She started to speak, but Travis came in from the yard with his phone in his hand. "The buyer wants an answer by next week," he said. Rachel shut her eyes. Margaret opened the back door. Cold rain blew against her cheek. "Then you'd better tell him you don't own my answer." She rolled the suitcase across the porch, lifted it down the 2 wooden steps, and placed it in the back of her station wagon. Before getting behind the wheel, she chose 3 keys from Frank's ring. One was for the farmhouse. One was for the old equipment gate. The third was short, dark with age, and marked by a streak of red paint. Margaret drove past the pear trees toward the shed. At the gate, the red-marked key turned on the first try. The track beyond the gate had almost disappeared under wet grass. Margaret drove slowly, keeping the left wheels away from a rut filled with brown water. The station wagon brushed low branches until the shed came into view. It looked worse at close range. The north edge of the roof had dropped several inches. Rainwater spilled over the gutter because the downspout was packed with leaves. Gray boards showed through peeling red paint. One window was covered with plywood, and the other had a green film across the glass. Margaret stopped beside the door. She left her suitcase in the car and carried the flashlight, level, and pry bar under her coat. The short key fit the lock. The door moved 2 inches and stopped against something inside. She put her shoulder to it, felt a warning under her collarbone, and changed position. With both hands low against the frame, she pushed again. A swollen feed sack slid across the floor, and the door opened far enough for her to enter sideways. Rain struck the roof in a dozen different notes. The flashlight found a narrow aisle between stacked lumber and old equipment. The fixed feed bins stood along the west wall. There were 4 of them, built from heavy boards and bolted to the floor with iron straps. Across from them, shelves sagged under cans, jars, rope, and boxes whose labels had faded. A drop of water struck Margaret's wrist. Then another landed in her hair. She aimed the light upward. Water followed a rafter and fell from a dark seam above the center aisle. Farther back, a steady trickle ran down the wall behind Arthur's green tool chest. Margaret moved the chest forward an inch. It was too heavy to shift without clearing the floor first. "Of course you put it under the leak," she said. She wasn't sure whether she meant Arthur or Frank. The shed smelled of wet wood, old grain, machine oil, and mice. Still, the air wasn't rotten. That mattered. A building could smell damp and be saved. A sweet, soft smell meant the framing had begun turning back into soil. Margaret swept the light along the sill plates. The south wall looked sound. The north corner needed attention. The floor dipped near the bins, but the boards by the door held her weight. She laid the level across the nearest shelf. The bubble ran hard to one side. "You're not telling me anything new." She took a plastic tub from beneath a workbench and set it under the worst leak. An enamel bucket caught the second. For the third, she used the swollen feed sack after cutting off its wet top and spreading the dry part over a crate. There was no point protecting junk, Travis would have said. Margaret had heard that tone from him since his 20s. If he couldn't see an immediate use for something, its owner had to defend keeping it. Frank had been the opposite. Frank saved bent hinges because one might match an old door someday. Between them, Margaret had spent years deciding what stayed and what went. Travis called her when he needed room. Frank called her when Travis had thrown away something necessary. She had mistaken being needed by both of them for having a place of her own. The thought came quietly. She didn't enjoy it, so she picked up a broom. Wet leaves had blown under the door. She swept them into a pile, then cleared mouse droppings and loose grain from the center aisle. Work made the dimensions honest. After 20 minutes, she could see where the floor was solid and where it wasn't. Her phone rang in her coat pocket. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. Margaret answered. "Yes? Are you at the shed?" "I am." "Travis said your car went through the gate. He can see the track from the house. He's worried you'll get hurt." He was less worried when he gave me the parcel. Rachel went silent. Margaret regretted the sentence as soon as she said it, not because it was false, but because regret had become a reflex. She had spent years smoothing the table after everyone else put down something sharp. "I'm checking the roof," she added, "in this rain. That's when leaks are easiest to find." "Mom, please go to Irene's. We can handle the shed tomorrow." Margaret looked at the bucket. Water ticked against the enamel. "Who's we?" "You know what I mean." "I don't think I do." "Travis has people. Those people work for the company. It's still the family company, not when decisions are made." Rachel lowered her voice. "I don't want another fight." Margaret could picture her in the farmhouse kitchen, one hand cupped around the phone. Rachel always spoke softly when she wanted someone else to carry the discomfort. "I'm not fighting," Margaret said. "I'm standing in my building. Can you at least tell me what you're planning?" "I'm planning to stop water from falling on Arthur's tools." "Why are his tools still there?" "That's something I intend to ask him." Rachel exhaled. "All right. Call me when you leave," Margaret nearly promised. It was what Rachel expected, a location, a departure time, and reassurance that her mother would create no additional problem. Instead, she said, "If you want to know where I am, you can call and ask. I won't be reporting in." I didn't mean it like that, I know. That was the trouble. Rachel rarely meant things the way they landed. Travis meant most things exactly. Margaret had spent years treating Rachel's good intentions as if they changed the result. She ended the call and stood listening to rain. The small refusal left her unsettled. It didn't feel like courage. It felt like forgetting a household rule. She went outside for a better look at the gutter. The downspout ended above a mound of mud beside the foundation. A rusted extension lay in the grass. Margaret fitted it back on and pointed it downhill. Then she dragged an empty feed bucket beneath the lowest corner of the gutter, turned it upside down, and climbed onto it. The bucket flexed. She climbed down at once. At 68, experience wasn't pretending balance had improved. Experience was knowing which foolish shortcut had already warned you. She found a short wooden crate inside, tested every joint, and placed a flat board on top. From there, she could reach the packed leaves with the hooked end of her pry bar. She pulled out a black clump of oak leaves and pine needles. Water burst through the downspout, struck the extension, and ran away from the wall. Margaret stepped down before allowing herself to feel pleased. The gutter still sagged, and the roof still leaked, but the water was no longer pouring against the foundation. One problem had listened. Her phone rang again. This time, it was Travis. "What did you say to Rachel? That she could call if she wanted to know where I was? She's upset. She was upset before she called. Mom, you don't have to make everyone feel guilty." Margaret looked toward the farmhouse. Through the rain and trees, she could just see the pale roof. "Is that what I'm doing? You know this settlement wasn't easy for us either. Then why was it ready before anyone explained the tax bill to me? The taxes are why I offered the quitclaim. After you assign them to me, they follow the parcel. That's how property works." Margaret wiped rain from her forehead. "Turn the power back on." "What?" "The shed has a panel. The service line is still attached. I want it checked and restored. You can't just demand company labor." "I'm not." "Give me the name of the electrician who disconnected it." There was a pause. "Dad had it shut off," Travis said. "Years ago?" "Which electrician? I don't remember." "You remember every subcontractor who worked this property." "What are you trying to prove? That there's a phone number you don't want to give me." Travis made a low sound. He did that when a customer caught a charge he hoped wouldn't be questioned. "I'll text it," he said. "Thank you. The account will have to be in your name. I assumed it would. And the reconnect isn't free. I assumed that too." He hung up without saying goodbye. A minute later, a contact card arrived by text. Margaret wrote the number on the back of the property schedule. Phones failed, batteries died, and paper remained readable. The exchange gave her what she needed, but it also made something plain. Travis had expected her to ask him to arrange everything. Then he could decide what was too expensive, too unsafe, or too late. Margaret had taught him that pattern. When he was starting the contracting business, she had answered his calls during cabinet installations. She found insurance papers, corrected estimates, and reminded Frank not to criticize him in front of workers. When Rachel took over the books, Margaret stopped asking to see them because Rachel said the questions made her feel mistrusted. Margaret had called that support. Some of it had been. Some of it had been surrender, dressed in useful clothes. A gust pushed rain through the open doorway. She shut the door as far as the swollen sill allowed, then called Arthur Barnes. He answered on the 6th ring. "If this is about a boat, I'm retired. It's Margaret, I know. Nobody else lets it ring long enough for me to reach the kitchen. Your tools are getting wet." Arthur stopped joking. "Where?" "In Frank's feed shed." "You're inside?" "I own it." Another silence followed, different from Rachel's. Arthur was arranging facts. "Since when?" "Since this morning in every way that matters." "What happened to the house?" "Travis has it. And you?" "I have the shed." Arthur muttered something she didn't catch. "Your green chest is under a roof leak," she continued. "I can't move it alone." "Is there anything inside that water will ruin?" "Yes." "What?" "Planes, chisels, 2 marking gauges, Frank's draw knife, unless he moved it. Then bring something to lift with. I'm coming now. The track is muddy. I've known that track longer than Travis has." Arthur arrived 25 minutes later in a faded blue pickup with a sheet of plywood tied over the bed. He wore rubber boots, a canvas coat, and a knitted cap pulled low over his ears. He climbed out carefully, favoring his left knee. He looked at Margaret's station wagon, then at the suitcase visible through the rear window. He didn't ask about it. "Show me the leak." Inside, he crouched beside the green chest and ran a hand along its back. Wet, not soaked. "I put the bucket there. I see that. I couldn't shift the chest. You weren't supposed to. This thing weighs more than good judgment." They cleared a path together. Arthur brought in a hand truck, but one wheel sank into a soft floorboard near the bins. He stopped immediately. "That's gone underneath," he said. "I noticed the dip. A dip and a bad joist aren't the same. They are when you're standing over them." Arthur looked at her, then nodded. He appreciated a correction when it was accurate. They slid 2 narrow boards beneath the hand truck's wheels to spread the load. Margaret steadied the chest while Arthur tipped it back. Her shoulder tightened, and she shifted her grip before the pain sharpened. Together, they moved the chest to the dry south wall. Arthur opened it. He lifted each wooden plane, checked the soles, and laid the tools on a towel. His hands slowed when he found the draw knife. Frank did leave it, he said. The handles were dark from use. One had a shallow notch near the end. He borrowed that 20 years ago, Arthur said. I told him he could keep it until he finished what he was doing. What was he doing? He didn't say. You never asked? I asked plenty. Frank answered what suited him. That much was true. Margaret had loved a man who could discuss the angle of a blade for an hour and say nothing about why he had been awake since 4 a.m. Arthur looked around the shed. When were you last in here? Before Frank died. Only at the door. He wouldn't let Travis store pipe fittings in here. Travis told me the place was useless. He told Travis it wasn't company storage. Margaret set the flashlight on the bench. Why? Arthur picked a spot of rust from a marking gauge, said the contents needed to stay where they were. Did he tell you what contents? No. Did he say they were valuable? He said they were yours to sort. Margaret looked toward the fixed bins. She had spent a year believing Frank had left her the one building nobody wanted. Arthur's answer didn't make the building sound valuable. It did something smaller and more difficult. It confirmed that Frank had made a choice, and that choice had included her judgment. She wanted to hold that close. Instead, she asked, "Can the roof be kept up?" Arthur followed her gaze to the sagging rafters. Yes, but not with a bucket. How long? If we brace the weak corner and cover the north slope, it'll stand through the week. A proper repair costs money. I have some. You'll need it for the taxes. I need the roof to last long enough to learn what I own. Arthur closed the tool chest. That sounds like work. Margaret picked up the sound end of the first brace. It is. Arthur took the other end and guided the brace beneath the sagging beam. Not there, Margaret said. 6 inches left. That puts it on the cracked board. Then lay a plate under it. Arthur found a thick plank behind the bins. Together, they worked it flat across 3 floorboards. Margaret held the brace upright while he turned the screwjack beneath it. The roof beam rose slowly. Dust loosened from the rafters and drifted through the flashlight beam. Enough, she said. Arthur stopped. It's still low. It took years to drop. We don't lift it all in one afternoon. They set a second brace near the north wall. The building gave a few dry creaks, then settled. Water continued to enter through the roof, but the beam no longer moved when the wind pressed against it. By the time they finished, daylight had faded behind the plywood-covered window. Arthur locked his tool chest and put the key in his pocket. You can't sleep here. I know. Good. I'm not asking permission. Also good. He carried her suitcase to the station wagon without discussing it. Margaret called Irene from the driver's seat and said she would need the spare room after all. She didn't explain the settlement. Irene had already heard enough from Rachel to understand that the farmhouse was changing hands. Margaret said she would arrive after stopping for food, and Irene said there was soup on the stove. Before leaving, Margaret went back to the shed alone. She placed the level, tape measure, and pry bar on the workbench. Then she removed the farmhouse key from Frank's ring. She held it for a moment before setting it inside her handbag, separate from the shed key. Travis would ask for it soon. The next morning, Margaret returned before 8. The rain had passed, leaving the field silver with standing water. Arthur was already there. He had brought a thermos, 2 folding ladders, roof jacks, rope, and a roll of heavy tarp. You planning to cover a house? She asked. I've seen the hole. You saw it from underneath. I also climbed halfway up before you arrived. At your age, Arthur handed her the thermos. You're only allowed to say that if you're staying on the ground. The coffee was strong and slightly sweet. Margaret drank half a cup while they walked around the shed. The roof boards beneath the old shingles were soft along the north edge. The damaged area was larger than it appeared from inside. Several shingles had lifted. A narrow branch had punched through near the ridge, and someone had covered the spot years earlier with sheet metal and roofing tar. The tar had split. A tarp buys days, Arthur said. Maybe 2 weeks if the wind behaves. The wind doesn't. No? What would you replace? North slope now? South slope before winter? Gutter all around? 2 rafters need sisters. Margaret looked at the roofline. And the corner? We brace it before putting weight above it. How much? For materials? For what I can't borrow, reuse, or make? Arthur named a figure a little above $5,000. Margaret had just under $24,000 in savings, $16,000 belonged to the tax deadline, whether she liked it or not. Paying for the roof would leave almost nothing for electrical work, plumbing, or a place to live. If I tarp it, she said, I can inspect the contents and sell what's usable. You might. You don't think there's enough. I think old feed equipment sells slowly. I think half the metal in there costs more to haul than it brings. There's lumber, some, and shelving, rotten shelving. I built those shelves. Arthur turned toward her. You did? The summer Rachel started college. Frank wanted storage and didn't want to pay for finished cabinets. I used shop scraps. That explains why they lasted. They didn't. They lasted longer than the roof. Margaret walked to the north wall. At the corner, she pressed the end of her screwdriver into a gray board. It entered too easily. A tarp would preserve the shed long enough to empty it. It would not make the building useful, and it would not make a buyer pay enough to cover the taxes. Travis knew that. His offer depended on the cost becoming frightening before the deadline. Margaret took out her phone. What are you doing? Arthur asked. Ordering the roof. He watched her call the building supplier Travis's company used. She gave the shed dimensions, asked for corrugated metal panels, underlayment, fasteners, 2 lengths of framing lumber, gutter parts, and delivery. She used her own name and her own bank card. When the order clerk asked for the company account, Margaret said, This isn't a company purchase. The final amount came to $5,380. She approved it. Afterward, her hand remained around the phone. Arthur poured more coffee into his cup. You can still cancel. I know. That's most of your room after taxes. I know that too. What happens if the contents don't sell? I own a dry shed. It sounded insufficient when spoken aloud, but it was a thing she could act on. Margaret had spent the previous year waiting for Travis and Rachel to decide what happened next. The roof order was the first decision that belonged entirely to her, including the consequences. Arthur put the thermos away. Deliveries when? Tomorrow afternoon. Then today we clear the north wall. They began with the shelves Margaret had built decades earlier. The upper sections came free easily. She removed screws while Arthur supported the frames. They stacked soundboards outside under the tarp and set the rotten pieces apart. The lower shelves resisted. Damp wood had swollen around the fasteners, and rust filled the screw heads. Margaret worked a flat bar behind the first upright. Pain crossed her right shoulder when she pulled. She stopped before Arthur could notice, changed hands, and leaned her weight into the bar. The upright released with a sharp crack. Arthur looked over. That your shoulder? That was the wood. I know what wood sounds like. It caught. So did you. Margaret set down the bar. I'll use my left. You'll use both after we cut the fasteners. He brought a reciprocating saw from his truck. Margaret disliked the noise and the rough cut, but it saved her shoulder. They removed the shelves in sections, exposing wall boards that hadn't seen daylight since she installed them. Behind the lowest shelf, the wood was stained black. Arthur pressed it with a knife. Surface mold. Boards still firm. That's one good thing. Don't sound surprised. Buildings take offense. They scrubbed the wall with a stiff brush and opened the uncovered window. The glass was intact beneath the green film. Margaret washed one corner with water from a jug. Pale morning light entered the shed. It changed the room more than she expected. The bins were still heavy shapes along the opposite wall. The floor still sagged. Yet with the shelves gone and the window exposed, Margaret could see the workbench clearly. It was Frank's old bench from the boat shop, scarred by clamps and edged with a strip of hardwood she recognized from their cabinet-making days. Near the vise, someone had driven a small finishing nail into the edge. Margaret touched it. She had a habit of hanging her apron on a nail exactly there. Frank had complained that the apron brushed against his knees. Then he had driven a second nail at the other end for his cap. That was how they settled most small disputes. Nobody apologized. The bench simply gained another nail. Arthur was examining the cleared wall. "Bring your light," he said. Margaret joined him. Fine lines had been scratched into the upright stud behind the former shelving. At first, they looked like damage from a saw blade. She wiped the surface with a dry rag. There were numbers. The writing was faint but deliberate. Frank had used a marking knife, not a pencil. A horizontal line crossed the stud about knee height. Beside it, he had scratched measurements and 2 short sets of initials. FC, Margaret read. The other one looks like AB. Arthur leaned closer. Those aren't mine. Same letters, not my hand. Beneath the initials was a date. The year was 1998. Margaret ran her finger beside the marks without touching them. What did he build in here that year? The bins were already here, weren't they? No. There were open grain barrels when we bought the place. Frank installed the bins later. Arthur looked across the aisle. The fixed bins had sloping fronts and hinged lids. Their iron straps ran down to bolts set through the floor. Each bin was deep enough to hold several sacks of feed. Margaret remembered sweeping grain from their corners, but she had never watched Frank construct them. These could be from that job, she said. Could be. The scratched figures were hard to read in the weak light. Margaret copied them onto the back of an old delivery receipt. One appeared to be the distance from the top edge of the bin to the apparent floor. Another was longer. Why 2 depths? She asked. Arthur didn't answer. They measured the height of the bin. The first figure matched within 1/8 of an inch. The second did not. Margaret measured again from the bin's top edge to the shed floor. Arthur held the end of the tape against the rim. She crouched, keeping her sore shoulder close to her side. 4 feet, 1 3/4, she said. That's the short mark. The long one says 5 feet, 10 3/4. Looks that way. That's a difference of 21 inches. Arthur took the tape outside. He measured from the same top level, using the horizontal siding seams as a guide, down to the lower edge of the floor framing. The ground was uneven, so he checked at 3 points. When he came back inside, mud covered both knees of his trousers. Well? Margaret asked. The longer number is real. What does it measure? The full depth from the top of the bin to the bottom of the framing. Margaret looked at the floor beneath her boots. There should have been a visible crawl space below the boards, but the outside foundation had been boxed in with old siding and corrugated tin. From inside, the bin fronts covered the floor joint. The difference could be nothing more than the framing depth and uneven ground. It could also mean Frank had built the bin platform differently from the rest of the shed. Arthur crouched and tapped the floor with the wooden handle of his screwdriver. The sound near the aisle was dull. Near the first bin, it changed slightly, but the board flexed under his weight. He stood at once. We don't test that again until it's supported. Can we see beneath it from outside? Not without taking off the foundation skirt. Then we take it off. After the roof delivery, and after we brace the floor from below. The ground is soaked. Yes. How long before it dries? With this soil? Long enough for your tax bill to become interesting. Margaret studied Frank's measurements again. She had ordered the roof to protect whatever ordinary equipment remained. Now she needed the building dry enough to answer a different question. Arthur ran one finger beside the cut marks. He didn't scratch these for the bins, he said. You just said they matched, one matched. But Frank marked ordinary work in pencil. Knife marks were for something he expected to cover. What kind of thing? Joinery you'd need to find later. Margaret glanced at the iron bolts holding the bins to the floor. Can those be removed? Yes, after the floor is safe. And if Travis asks what we're doing, Arthur straightened. What are we doing? Margaret folded the copied measurements and placed them in her wallet. We're repairing my shed. Arthur gave a single nod. The roofing materials arrived the following afternoon on a flatbed truck. The driver called from the equipment gate because the ground beyond it looked soft. Margaret walked out to meet him with the delivery slip in her hand. We can set it beside the road, he said. I'm not taking that truck across the field. I wouldn't ask you to. She had already laid 2 rows of salvage boards across the firmest part of the track. Arthur waited behind her with his pickup and a small utility trailer. They transferred the shorter lumber by hand. The metal panels went onto the trailer 6 at a time, strapped flat so the wind couldn't lift them. It took 4 trips to move everything to the shed. On the last trip, Travis's truck slowed on Parker Road. He looked through the open gate but didn't turn in. Margaret saw him. She kept one hand on the metal panel while Arthur tightened the strap. You want to tell him? Arthur asked. He can see it's roofing? That isn't what I asked. No. Arthur pulled the strap tight. All right. They spent the rest of the afternoon building temporary supports beneath the 2 weak rafters. Arthur cut the lumber on sawhorses outside. Margaret measured and marked each piece. Her shoulder behaved as long as she kept her right elbow below her chest. By evening, the roof had enough support for them to work above it. The next morning was clear and cold. Margaret wore an old tool belt over her jeans. It had been hanging in the back of her station wagon since she retired. The leather was stiff, and sawdust still clung inside one pocket. Arthur noticed but said nothing. They stripped the damaged shingles from the north slope. Margaret stayed on the lower ladder and passed tools. Arthur worked from a roof jack with a safety rope around his waist. When he uncovered the old patch near the ridge, he stopped. Frank did this. How can you tell? Too much tar. That could describe half the men in Ocean County. Not this need underneath. He lifted the rusted sheet metal. Below it, the broken roof board had been trimmed square. Frank had fitted a cedar patch into the opening before covering it. He meant to come back, Margaret said. Looks that way. Frank had meant to come back to many things. A loose drawer pull in the farmhouse. A stack of unopened mail. The pear tree, he said, needed pruning. Illness had made ordinary plans sound permanent until they simply stopped. Margaret handed Arthur the new board. They worked until noon, ate cheese sandwiches on overturned buckets, and returned to the roof. By late afternoon, underlayment covered the repaired boards. The first metal panels went on before sunset. The following day, they finished the north slope. Margaret drove the last fastener herself from the ladder. The drill twisted when the screw bit into fresh lumber. Pain moved through her shoulder and down her arm. She lowered the drill. Arthur looked over from the other ladder. That's enough. One screw. That's how people explain the injury after it gets worse. Margaret climbed down. She hated leaving the last piece of work to someone else. That feeling had kept her at jobs long after her hands went numb and through family dinners when she should have let the food get cold. Arthur drove the final screw. They fitted the new gutter and directed both downspouts toward the drainage ditch. Then Arthur climbed onto the roof with a garden hose connected to a water tank in his truck. Margaret stood inside with a flashlight. Water ran over the metal. She waded beneath the old leaks. Nothing struck her hair. The enamel bucket remained empty. The wall behind the green tool chest stayed dry. "Keep it going," she called. Arthur let the water run another 5 minutes. One thin drip appeared near the door. Margaret followed it upward and found that it came through an old nail hole on the untouched south slope. She marked the spot with chalk. The north side held. When Arthur came down, Margaret showed him the dry bucket. "That cost you more than $5,000, he said. "I want a warmer celebration. You now own a dry bucket." "Better." He poured the water outside and hung the bucket on a wall hook. The repaired roof changed what was possible. They could leave tools out overnight. Lumber could be stacked without plastic. The bench could be cleaned. Margaret could inspect boxes without moving them through rain. It also changed what retreat would mean. She couldn't tell herself the shed was merely something to sell before the taxes came due. Her money was now fastened to its rafters. That afternoon, she called the county number printed on the tax notice. A clerk confirmed the amount and the date. 41 days remained. Partial payment would reduce interest but would not stop the next enforcement step. Margaret wrote everything in a small notebook. After reserving the tax money and paying for the roof, she had less than $3,000 available. She closed the notebook and put it beside Frank's scratched measurements. "We look underneath tomorrow," she said. Arthur was sharpening a chisel. "Your shoulder needs tomorrow. My shoulder can watch." The next morning, Margaret arrived with a heating pad tucked under her coat and a bag of ice in a lunch cooler. Arthur pretended not to notice either one. They began outside along the west wall. The foundation skirt was a mixture of corrugated tin, painted boards, and pieces of exterior plywood. Some sections had been nailed. Others were held by screws so old their heads broke when turned. Margaret worked from a low stool. Arthur removed the higher fasteners. They labeled each reusable piece with chalk before setting it aside. Behind the first panel, ordinary floor joists rested on short block piers. Mud filled the space beneath them. There were raccoon prints near the corner and a nest made from insulation. Behind the second panel, the framing changed. A heavy timber ran beneath the feed bins, lower than the rest of the floor. Vertical boards enclosed the space from the timber to the floor above. They were fitted closely together and coated with something dark. Arthur scraped a corner with his knife, then smelled the blade. Pine tar. For damp, most likely. Frank used it on boats. He used it anywhere water thought it was invited. Margaret shone the flashlight into the narrow opening. The enclosed section continued beneath all 4 bins. Its bottom sat almost exactly 21 inches below the visible floor. The longer measurement was correct. "What would you call that?" she asked. "A box. A box has an opening, not always where you're looking." Arthur cleared mud from the nearest joint. The boards weren't simply nailed across the framing. Their edges overlapped in a tight-stepped seam. Margaret lowered herself from the stool to one knee. Rabetted. Yes. He built a closed compartment under the bins. He built a closed space. That's the same thing, not until we know it was meant to hold something. Margaret aimed the light along the timber. Near the center, she saw two small knife cuts. They formed an angled mark like an open bird's beak. Is that Frank's? Arthur moved closer. His expression changed. What? He used that mark when he built something with a concealed joint. It told him which side released first. So, where does this release? Not from here. Arthur crawled backward and stood. Mud covered one sleeve and the front of his coat. Inside, they examined the bins again. The iron straps passed over the bin frames and ended in square bolts through the floor. Rust made the nuts look fused to the threads. Even if they could remove them, the floor near the first two bins flexed under a careful step. Arthur placed the level across the aisle. The bubble showed a drop of nearly an inch toward the west wall. We need support all the way under this section, he said, not just the roof braces. How much support? 2 beams across the joists, cribbing on firm ground. At least 4 screw jacks to lift it evenly. Can we rent them? Yes. How much? That's not the larger problem. The ground, the access, and the weight of those bins. They may be empty, but they're built from full timber. If we lift one before the floor is level, the joists could roll. Margaret opened the nearest lid. The inside was dusty and empty, except for a handful of hardened grain. She measured the walls, the sloping front, and the iron straps. Could we cut the bins apart? We could also open your car with an axe, I'm asking. If Frank built a compartment beneath them, the bins may be part of the lid. Cutting them could damage whatever is below. That answer created an obligation Margaret hadn't expected. Finding the space was no longer enough. She had to protect it before she knew whether it held anything. Arthur wiped his hands on a rag. There's something else. What? My tools. They're dry now. That chest is mine. The loose tools on the bench are mixed. Some are mine, some were Frank's, and some came from the old boat shop. If we open anything, we list what's here first. You think I'd take them? No. I think your children will claim nobody knows whose property is whose. Margaret disliked hearing it because he was right. We make an inventory, she said, and we photograph the shed before moving the bins. I don't want Travis knowing about the space yet. He doesn't need to know until the floor is safe. A truck door slammed outside. Travis came through the open doorway without knocking. His work boots left wet marks on the newly swept floor. You ordered materials on our supplier account? My card paid the invoice. They called because the delivery address is company property. The shed parcel isn't. The road and gate are. Margaret set the flashlight on the bench. You can use the door next time. It was open. That doesn't make it yours. Travis looked at the repaired roof, the cleared wall, and the stacked shelf boards. His eyes stopped on the scratch figures exposed behind the old shelving. What's that? Measurements? He stepped closer. Margaret moved between him and the wall without making a show of it. Travis saw Frank's initials. Dad marked this. Yes. Then it concerns the estate. The estate assigned me the building and its contents. A mark on a wall isn't contents. No, it's a mark on my wall. Arthur busied himself closing his tool chest, but he didn't leave. Travis looked toward the bins. Margaret couldn't tell whether he had noticed anything unusual. The foundation panels they removed were outside, out of sight from the doorway. You need to stop putting money into this place, he said. The quick claim offer won't stay open forever. There hasn't been an offer. There's been a blank space where a number belongs. I can have one for you by Friday. Put it in writing. His face tightened. What are you looking for? A safe floor. That's all? That's enough? Travis looked at Arthur. Did Dad tell you something about this shed? Arthur shut the chest lid. He told me not to store wet rope near good steel. I'm serious. So was he. Travis turned back to Margaret. If you find company property, you're required to return it. If I find anything that belongs to the company, I'll identify it. That isn't your call. It is until someone proves otherwise. For a moment, neither moved. Then Margaret took the farmhouse key from her handbag and placed it on the workbench between them. You came for this sooner or later. Travis picked it up. His fingers closed around it, but he didn't look satisfied. Margaret walked to the door and held it open. Call before you come back. This is still family land, and this door is mine. Travis went outside. He stopped beside the removed foundation panels, looked down at the exposed framing, and then toward the west wall. Margaret watched him from the doorway. He hadn't seen enough to understand the enclosed space. He had seen enough to know she was no longer cleaning the shed for him. Travis took out his phone as he walked back to his truck. Margaret closed the door and turned the key. The lock held when Travis tried the handle from outside. He didn't knock. He walked to his truck and drove away. Arthur waited until the engine faded. That went well. He left. That's one definition. Margaret pulled a sheet of plywood across the opening in the foundation skirt. They fastened it with 4 temporary screws. Anyone could remove them, but nobody could pretend they had entered by accident. Arthur wrote the date and time on the first page of the inventory. They began with his green tool chest. He placed each item on Frank's bench while Margaret photographed it. He identified 6 wooden planes, 9 chisels, 2 marking gauges, a hand drill, a brace, and the draw knife Frank had borrowed. Arthur's initials appeared on some tools. Others had marks he recognized from the old boat shop. "What about the draw knife?" Margaret asked. "Mine by purchase. Frank's by possession. That won't help. It's the truth." She listed it as Arthur's property, loaned to Frank. They moved to the bench drawers. Most held ordinary things: drill bits, nails, sharpening stones, hinges, pencils, chalk, and several folding rulers. Margaret found 3 cabinet scrapers she had ground herself. Each had a small half-moon filed into one corner. "These are mine." Arthur looked at the mark. "You're sure?" "I did that so Frank would stop taking them." "Worked beautifully." She placed them beside her handbag. The lower drawer contained clamps from the cabinet shop. Margaret knew their handles and the glue stains on their bars. Frank had repaired one with a brass pin after Travis backed over it in the yard. She remembered telling Frank not to make a fuss. Travis had been 26 and embarrassed in front of 2 workers. Frank had wanted him to replace the clamp. Margaret said it was only a tool. Now she held the repaired handle and saw the pattern clearly. She had protected Travis from the cost of small mistakes until he expected protection from larger ones. Arthur watched her turn the clamp over. "Yours?" he asked. "Mine, but leave it on the list." They worked through the morning. The inventory settled one question. Very little in the open part of the shed belonged to the farm company. There were 2 feed scales with company tags, a stack of plastic poultry trays, and an electric motor from an old grain conveyor. Everything else could be tied to Margaret, Arthur, Frank, or the former boat shop. Arthur signed beneath his items. Margaret signed the full list. She printed 2 copies at Irene's house that evening and stored the photographs on a small memory card. The next day they rented 4 screw jacks. The rental clerk helped Arthur load them into his pickup. Margaret paid the deposit from what remained of her available savings. She also bought heavy plastic, treated blocks, and 2 beams long enough to span the weak joists. Back at the shed, the ground beneath the west side was still too wet. Arthur pushed a steel rod into the mud. It sank nearly a foot before meeting firm soil. "We can't set jacks on that," he said. "We put blocks under them. The blocks will sink together. How long if we drain it? Depends where the water's coming from." They dug a shallow channel from the foundation toward the ditch. Water collected almost at once, not from the sky, but from the saturated ground beneath the shed. The old downspout had been emptying beside the foundation for years. Margaret followed the channel with her eyes. The roof caused the floor. Part of it. And the bad floor keeps us from opening the bins. Yes. One neglected job had leaned into the next until the whole building appeared useless. Travis had seen proof that the shed should be surrendered. Margaret saw a list of repairs in the order they had to be done. They widened the channel and lined its entrance with gravel from a pile near the old equipment gate. Margaret filled buckets only halfway to spare her shoulder. Even so, the ache settled deep beneath the joint. Arthur took the handle from her after the 5th trip. "I can carry gravel. You can also stop. I'll stop when we have enough. You said that on the roof. And we finished the roof." Arthur set down the bucket. "If you ruin that shoulder, who opens the shed?" The question irritated her because it worked. Margaret sat on the low stool and pressed the cold pack beneath her coat. Arthur carried the next loads. She directed the grade of the channel and checked it with the level. By mid-afternoon, a thin stream ran toward the ditch. It wasn't enough to support the jacks yet, but it was movement in the right direction. Rachel arrived just before they stopped. She parked near the pear trees and walked across the wet field in shoes that weren't made for mud. She held a white envelope inside her coat. Margaret stayed seated. You should have worn boots. I didn't think I'd be walking this far. The track's open. Travis told me not to drive on it while it's wet. Did he? Rachel glanced at Arthur. Can I talk to Mom alone? Arthur carried the shovel toward his truck. I need to clean this anyway. You don't have to leave, Margaret said. Rachel's mouth tightened. It's personal, so is the shed. Arthur stopped near the truck, far enough away not to hear ordinary conversation, but close enough to remain visible. Rachel looked at the drainage channel, the new roof, and the removed foundation panels. You've done a lot. Some. Your shoulder looks bad. Margaret had forgotten the cold pack was still tucked beneath her coat. It's sore. You shouldn't be doing this. I built cabinets for 31 years. You've been retired for 6. My hands didn't forget. That isn't what I meant. Rachel opened the envelope. Inside was a personal check. Margaret didn't take it. What's that? $6,000? For what? To cover what you spent on the roof, with a little extra. Why? Because this has gone too far. The roof? All of it. Rachel held out the check. The amount was written in her neat bookkeeping hand. The memo line was blank. Margaret looked at her daughter's face. Rachel seemed frightened, but not of the shed. She was afraid of delay, questions, and anything that couldn't be placed in the proper box before a lender looked at her life. What do you want me to sign? Nothing today. Then what does the money buy? I want you to stop pulling the building apart. Let Travis give you a fair number for the parcel. Once he does, sign the quitclaim and move somewhere safe. Somewhere you can visit? Rachel flinched. That's not fair. No, it's a question. Of course I'd visit. How often did you visit when I lived in the farmhouse? I came over all the time. You came to collect records, leave groceries, or speak with your father. When he died, you came to sort the accounts. Rachel lowered the check. You know how much I had to handle. Margaret did know. That was why she had never said any of this. Rachel had handled bills, insurance forms, funeral charges, and company records. She had also handled every conversation, as if completing a task proved the relationship was sound. What happens to your mortgage if this takes another month? Margaret asked. Rachel's gaze moved toward the shed door. The lender wants proof that the estate distribution is complete. I signed the settlement. They're asking about possible claims against the family company. Travis told them the land sale would improve the company's position. So, your mortgage depends on his sale? Not directly. Rachel, the company is listed as a family asset source. They want clean records. And Travis won't call the records clean while I own the shed. He says you might claim company equipment or challenge the settlement. Do you believe that? I believe you're investigating something. Margaret looked at the white envelope. What did Travis tell you about the marks on the wall? That Dad's initials are there? Anything else? He said Arthur was helping you tear into the foundation. We removed rotten panels. What are you looking for? I'm trying to understand why the floor is built differently beneath the bins. Rachel's eyes went to the west wall. She didn't know about the enclosed space. Margaret could see that immediately. Differently how? I'll tell you when I know. Mom, if Dad used company money to build something, Travis may have a right to it. Build what? I don't know. Storage, equipment, anything. The shed and its contents are mine. That wording could still be disputed. By whom? Rachel folded the check once, though it was already flat. Nobody wants a dispute. You brought $6,000 to prevent one. I brought it to help you. Then write gift in the memo line and tell Travis it has no condition. Rachel stared at her. Margaret waited. I can't do that, Rachel said. Then it isn't help. Rachel returned the check to the envelope. Mud darkened the sides of her shoes. You're making this harder for everyone. I'm asking what the money requires. It requires you to stop. There it was, plain at last. Margaret stood carefully. No. Rachel's face changed. She had expected resistance, but not refusal. Margaret had always made room when either child came to her with a need. Sometimes she gave money. More often, she gave agreement. What if there's nothing there? Rachel asked. Then I'll have a safe floor. And if there is, I'll identify it before anyone claims it. Rachel looked toward Arthur. You trust him more than your own family? With tools and timber? Yes. That's cruel. It's specific. Rachel walked back across the field without saying goodbye. Arthur returned when her car reached the road. How much? He asked. You heard? I saw the check. $6,000. That would cover the roof. It would buy the quitclaim. Arthur nodded toward the drainage channel. Water was still moving through it. At least the ditch doesn't have conditions. They covered the exposed foundation and locked the shed. That evening, Travis sent Margaret a message. He said no estate property was to be sold, removed, damaged, or concealed. He wanted a copy of the inventory by the following morning. Margaret read the message twice. She sent him photographs of the 2 company-tagged scales, the poultry trays, and the conveyor motor. She wrote that those items would remain untouched. She did not send the full inventory or the photographs of Frank's marks. Travis replied almost immediately. Anything bearing Dad's initials is family property until reviewed. Margaret placed the phone beside her notebook. The initials weren't the useful fact. The difference in the measurements was. Travis had now told her exactly what he would claim if she uncovered anything tied to Frank. The floor had to be made safe. The opening had to be documented. And when the time came, Margaret could no longer afford to have only Arthur beside her. Arthur understood before she explained. "We need someone without a family name attached," he said. "We need the floor first." They returned the next morning to find the drainage channel still running. The mud beneath the west wall had firmed enough to hold a boot without swallowing the heel. Arthur spread heavy plastic across the ground. They laid treated blocks over it, then built low cribs beneath the joists. The work was slow because nothing fit the first time. One block rocked, another sat too close to a pier. The first beam caught on an old water pipe that led nowhere. Margaret measured the available space and marked a shallow notch. "No," Arthur said. "We don't cut the beam. It's 1/2 inch. And that 1/2 inch is where the load goes." She looked again. Then the pipe comes out. The pipe ended beneath the center aisle. It had been disconnected years earlier and capped with a flattened brass fitting. Arthur cut it near the foundation, and Margaret pulled the loose section through the opening. The beam slid into place. They set 2 screw jacks beneath it. Arthur turned one while Margaret watched the level inside. Every quarter turn raised the floor a fraction. Dust moved in the seams near the bins. "Hold," she called. Arthur stopped. "The 3rd joist isn't coming with it." He crawled out and joined her. One floorboard had lifted slightly while the next remained low. Beneath them, the joist had split lengthwise near an old knot. "That has to be sistered before we lift farther," Margaret said. "Yes. We have lumber. We need to get it under there." They carried a treated board around the shed. Arthur took the heavier end. Margaret guided the front through the foundation opening. The board caught on the edge of a pier. "Back," Arthur said. Margaret pulled. It didn't move. "Lower your end." "I am. Not enough." She crouched and tried to turn the board. The awkward angle forced her right arm away from her body. Her shoulder tightened, then gave a sharp internal pull. The board slipped. Margaret caught it before it struck the ground. Pain ran from her shoulder into her neck. Her hand opened on its own. Arthur dropped his end and came around the corner. "Don't move it. I'm not. Sit down. It's a strain. Sit." Margaret made it to the low stool. The pain eased when she held her forearm across her waist, but returned when she tried to lift it. Arthur brought the cold pack from her cooler. "You knew this was bad," he said. "I knew it was sore. You knew it before the roof. We had to cover the roof. We didn't have to use your shoulder as a tool." She pressed the cold pack against the joint. "Finish setting the board?" "No. The floor is half lifted. And stable on 2 jacks. We rented 4. There'll still be 4 after a doctor looks at you." "I don't need a doctor." Arthur picked up her car keys from the bench. "You can go with me, or I can call Rachel." Margaret stared at him. "That's low." It worked. At the walk-in clinic, she sat beneath bright lights with her coat folded on her lap. Arthur filled a paper cup from the water dispenser and read every poster on the wall without appearing to read any of them. The examination took less than 20 minutes. The clinician moved Margaret's arm, asked where it hurt, and stopped when Margaret's face tightened. Nothing appeared torn badly enough to require immediate imaging. That was the good part. The rest was less useful. Margaret had inflamed the tendons around her shoulder and likely worsened an older injury. She was told not to lift, pull, drill overhead, or carry anything heavy with that arm for several weeks. "If it doesn't improve, you'll need imaging and a specialist," the clinician said. "I'm repairing a building, then repair it with your left hand and someone else's right." Arthur looked at the floor so Margaret wouldn't see him approve. The clinic charge and medicine came out of the small amount she had left beyond the tax money. The expense wasn't ruinous. It was simply one more subtraction from a number that had stopped feeling generous. At Irene's house, Margaret struggled to remove her shirt without lifting her elbow. She stood in the guest room with one sleeve caught around her wrist and nearly called for help. Instead, she sat on the bed and worked the fabric loose a little at a time. That was the moment the injury became real, not when the board slipped, not when the clinician warned her. It became real when an ordinary shirt required a plan. She slept badly and woke before dawn. Arthur called at 7. "I'm going to check the jacks. Don't lift without me. I don't take medical orders from cabinet makers." "You don't take any orders." "Correct." Margaret heard his truck door close in the background. "Arthur, wait. For what? Who can witness the opening?" He was quiet for a moment. "Depends what you think is in there." "I don't know. Then you need someone who understands Frank's work, not just property." "Who?" "Call Connie Lyons." Margaret knew the name, though she hadn't spoken to Connie in years. Connie worked at the Maritime Museum near the bay. She had attended boat launches when Frank and Arthur still built small skiffs together. She bought work from local carvers and organized exhibits about trades that disappeared when the people doing them died. "Why, Connie, she saw Frank carve. So did you. I saw him carve handles, plugs, wedges, and anything else he needed." Connie saw the birds. Margaret sat upright too quickly. Her shoulder objected. "What birds?" "Working decoys. Frank made a few for hunting. He made more than a few." "How many?" "I couldn't tell you. You were his partner. In boats. Frank carved alone." Margaret thought of winter evenings when Frank stayed in the shed after feeding the hens. He came home with cedar dust on his cuffs. She had assumed he was making replacement blocks or repairing handles. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I thought you knew." The words hurt more than they should have. Margaret had been Frank's wife. She had shared a bank account, a bed, a business, and the long final year when he needed help buttoning his shirt. Yet Arthur had carried a fact about him that had never entered the farmhouse. "What did he do with them?" she asked. "Used some, traded some, wouldn't sell the best ones. Where are the best ones?" "I don't know." Margaret looked toward the closet where her work clothes hung. "I'll call her." Connie answered the museum phone herself. Her voice was lower than Margaret remembered. "Margaret Cole?" "Yes. Arthur just left me a message saying you might call. He moves quickly when it doesn't involve following instructions." "That sounds like him." Margaret explained only what she could confirm. Frank had scratched measurements behind shelves. The figures showed a closed space beneath the feed bins. The construction included pine tar, tight overlapping seams, and a concealed joint mark Arthur recognized. Connie didn't interrupt until Margaret mentioned the year cut into the stud. 1998? "Yes. Are you sure? I copied it and photographed it." "What month?" "There's no month." Connie asked whether Margaret had found bird patterns, carved heads, paint jars, or blocks of white cedar. "Nothing like that in the open shed." "Any ledgers?" "No." "Photographs of Frank carving?" "Not that I've seen." Margaret could hear movement on the other end, then a drawer closing. "Why does the year matter?" she asked. Connie took a moment before answering. "Two working decoys came into the museum's study collection years ago. They were found separately, but they're clearly by the same hand. Neither is signed. We've always called the maker the Barnegat hand because both birds came from families who hunted the bay." "You think Frank made them?" "I've wondered. Why?" "I watched him carve at Arthur's boat shop one winter. He shaped the breast in 3 long cuts and left a narrow shelf beneath the tail. I hadn't seen anyone else do it quite that way. Years later, I saw the same choices in those 2 birds." "That isn't proof." "No, it isn't even enough for attribution." "Then why didn't you ask him?" "I did." "What did he say?" "He told me ducks didn't care whose name was underneath." Margaret closed her eyes. That sounded exactly like Frank. Connie continued. "I asked if he had patterns or photographs. He said working men had work, not archives. He could be difficult. He was private. There's a difference. Not to the person asking." Connie gave a brief laugh. Then her voice became careful. "Margaret, I don't know what's beneath those bins. It may be empty. It may hold farm records or spare parts. But if Frank preserved birds' patterns, photographs, or dated work notes together, that could answer a question the museum has carried for a long time." "What question?" "Whether the same unknown carver made a group of decoys that have been turning up around the bay for years." Margaret looked at the copied measurements on Irene's bedside table. "How many decoys?" "More than 2 were suspected. Only 2 have enough history for us to study seriously. Without records, we can't build a responsible case. And if there are records, then they have to be examined with the objects: wood, paint, tools, photographs, dates, all of it. One thing supporting another. Connie wasn't promising value. She wasn't even promising Frank had made the museum's birds. She was telling Margaret that opening the compartment carelessly could destroy an answer. "I was going to sell whatever equipment I found," Margaret said. "Don't sell or clean anything connected to carving. I haven't found anything. If you do, leave the dust. Don't oil the tools. Don't wipe paint. Photograph the exact position before moving an object," Margaret wrote with her left hand. Her letters looked like they belonged to someone else. "Would you come to the shed?" "Yes, after the floor is safe. I can witness the opening, but I can't authenticate a collection for a purchase. That would require an independent conservator. We're a long way from a collection. You're a long way from an empty space, too." After the call, Margaret sat without moving. Her first plan had been simple: repair enough of the shed to sell ordinary equipment, pay the taxes, and find somewhere modest to live. That goal had already cost her more than $5,000, a damaged shoulder, and whatever remained of Rachel's willingness to call their disagreement temporary. Now selling quickly was no longer enough. If Frank had left evidence of his work, speed could scatter it. Cleaning could erase it. A careless opening could make every later claim weaker. Margaret called Arthur. "The jacks still level?" she asked. "Yes. Don't raise them. I wasn't going to. Don't remove a bolt. Don't open a bin. Don't wipe anything." What did Connie say? She said Frank may have made 2 birds the museum can't identify. Arthur was quiet. "She said may," Margaret added. "Nothing is proven. What do you want to do?" Margaret looked at her right arm, resting uselessly across her waist. "We finish the floor properly. We photograph every stage. When the bins are ready to move, Travis and Rachel will be there. You want them inside? I want them unable to say later that something appeared after they left. That changes the job?" "Yes." "And the taxes? They still have to be paid." "With what?" Margaret picked up the rejected quitclaim offer Rachel had never managed to make clean. "I don't know yet," she said it aside. "But we're not repairing the shed to empty it anymore," Arthur said. "Then we need rules." Margaret opened her notebook with her left hand. "Go ahead. Nobody works alone. Nobody moves an object before it's photographed. Nobody cleans anything except the floor we have to stand on. And nobody enters without one of us present. That includes Travis, especially Travis." Arthur looked at her shoulder. "You direct the lift. I can turn a jack. With your left hand. With whichever hand behaves." He gave her a look. "My left," she said. Margaret spent the rest of the morning creating a record of the shed as it stood. She photographed every wall from the doorway, then took closer pictures of the bins, bolts, floor seams, Frank's measurements, and the enclosed framing outside. She placed a ruler beside each knife mark before photographing it. Arthur held a numbered card in each picture. "This feels foolish," he said. "It will feel less foolish when someone asks what changed." They put the memory card in an envelope. Margaret signed across the flap and asked Arthur to do the same. She stored it in Irene's metal document box with the settlement papers. Then she bought a new padlock. It was nothing special, just a weatherproof lock with 3 keys. Margaret kept one, Arthur took one. The third went into the document box inside a smaller signed envelope. At the shed, she photographed the old lock before removing it. She recorded the time the new one was installed. Arthur watched her write. "You've become unpleasantly organized. I raised a bookkeeper. She'll appreciate this. No, she'll understand it." Connie came the following afternoon. Her car had the Maritime Museum's name printed in small blue letters on the front doors. Margaret noticed it as soon as Connie turned through the gate. "That's discreet," she said when Connie stepped out. "It's the only car they give me." Connie wore plain boots and carried a camera, a clipboard, and a clean pair of cotton gloves in a plastic bag. She was 62, with short gray hair and the direct gaze of someone accustomed to examining objects while their owners explained too much. She hugged Margaret gently, avoiding the sore shoulder. "You look like Frank did when he was told not to lift," Connie said. He ignored the instruction. "Yes. I'm doing better than that." Arthur made a doubtful sound from beside the shed. Connie didn't enter at once. She photographed the exterior, the repaired roof, and the temporary plywood covering the foundation opening. Margaret unlocked the door while Connie recorded it. Inside, Connie stopped at Frank's bench. I know this bench. From the boat shop? It stood beside the north window. Frank kept his sharpening stone in that drawer. Margaret opened the narrow upper drawer. The stone lay inside, wrapped in an oily cloth. Connie didn't touch it. That doesn't prove anything, she said. Benches move. Tools move. People remember incorrectly. You remembered the drawer. I did. Arthur leaned against the doorframe. You always this cheerful at the museum? Only when someone wants me to promise more than the evidence can support. Margaret liked the answer. Connie examined the measurements behind the removed shelves. She photographed the date and the knife marks. Then she looked inside each feed bin without reaching in. They appear empty, she said. They are, Margaret replied. Appear empty is what I can say without moving anything. You and Arthur should form a club. We did. He was removed for impatience. Arthur went outside to check the drainage channel. Connie crouched near the first iron strap. These bolts are older than the roof repair, but newer than the original floor. Can you tell when they were installed? Not from looking. The shape is consistent with the late 1990s, but that covers a lot of hardware. The date on the stud says 1998. That helps establish when Frank marked the wall. It doesn't date the bolts by itself. Margaret rested her left hand on the bin lid. Arthur says you watched Frank carve several times. Here? Once here, mostly at the boat shop. Margaret turned toward her. You were in this shed? Years ago. Frank brought me out to look at a cedar plank he thought the museum might want for demonstrations. The bins were already installed. Did you see him open them? No. We stood near the door. He was protective of this place. Why? He said damp hands touched everything. That doesn't make sense. It did to Frank. Connie moved toward the workbench and studied its surface. There were dozens of cuts, clamp dents, and small holes. Near the back edge, she found a shallow oval worn into the wood. He fixed a bench hook here, she said. For carving, for holding small work. It could have held cabinet parts too. Margaret had used a similar hook for drawer fronts. Again, the fact pointed in more than one direction. Can you confirm anything useful? She asked. Connie looked at the room before answering. I can confirm that this bench came from the place where I saw Frank carve working birds. I can confirm that he used the shed after the bins were installed. I can confirm the enclosed space hasn't been opened from outside since your photographs were taken, assuming the images are current. They are. I can also confirm that none of this identifies him as the unknown maker. Margaret nodded. Right, exactly that. Connie did. Her signed statement was modest. It didn't mention value. It didn't claim the space held decoys. It did establish that a witness familiar with Frank's work had inspected the shed before the bins moved. That was enough for the day. After Connie left, Margaret and Arthur returned to the floor. The drainage channel had done its job. The soil beneath the shed was firm at the surface, though still damp below. They laid wider pads beneath the cribbing and checked each one for movement. Margaret stayed inside with the level. Arthur worked below. He fitted the sister board against the split joist. Instead of asking Margaret to carry or hold it, he used a rope looped over the beam. She pulled the free end with her left hand while he guided the board upward. 2 inches, he called. Margaret pulled. Hold. She wrapped the rope around a cleat beside the door. Arthur clamped the new board in place, drilled through both pieces, and installed bolts with broad washers. They did not use company labor. They did not ask Travis for equipment. Everything came from Margaret's money, Arthur's truck, or the tools they had listed. When the joist was secure, they set the remaining beam and placed all 4 screw jacks. Arthur crawled out, ready. Margaret stood near the first bin with the level across the floor. They raised the jacks in sequence, 1/4 turn at the northeast point, then the southeast, then the 2 center supports. Margaret called each movement. Arthur repeated it before turning a handle. The floor rose slowly. At the first ½ inch, the old boards creaked. At 3/4, rust flaked from one iron strap. Margaret stopped the lift and checked every bolt. None had shifted. The bin frames remained square. Continue, she said. They brought the floor level within 1/8 of an inch. Arthur added solid cribbing beside each jack, so the weight would not depend on the rental equipment alone. Then they waited. They ate lunch outside. Margaret kept checking the shed doorway for movement. After an hour, the level hadn't changed. Arthur carried in 2 bags of sand and placed them near the west wall. The floor held. He added 2 more. No board flexed. Margaret walked the length of the bins. For the first time, the surface beneath her boots felt firm. That's it, Arthur said. Safe enough to work. Safe enough to remove the bolts, with a support frame over the first bin. We build that next. Her new strategy had succeeded once. The floor no longer controlled them. The compartment could be approached without risking the building, or whatever might be inside. Margaret photographed the level, the sistered joist, the beams, the cribbing, and the load test. Arthur signed the work log. She called Connie before leaving. The floor is braced, Margaret said. Permanently supported by cribbing, with jacks available for adjustment. Did the bins move? No. Did any seam open? No. Good. What's next? A lifting frame. Then I set an inspection date. Give me several days' notice. I will. And Margaret, yes? If you invite your children, tell them in writing what will happen. Don't surprise them. Margaret understood. A surprise would satisfy nobody except the part of her still hurt by that kitchen table. It would also give Travis an excuse to claim the process was staged against him. She wrote the message that evening. The floor beneath the fixed feed bins has been professionally braced through documented repair work. The bins have not been lifted or unbolted. I intend to inspect the enclosed construction beneath them, with Arthur Barnes and Connie Lyons present. Both of you are invited to attend. Nothing will be removed before it is photographed and listed. I will send the date after the lifting frame is ready. She read it twice. Then she removed the word professionally. Arthur and Margaret had done competent work, but neither was operating as a hired structural contractor. She sent the message to Travis and Rachel. Rachel replied first. Why is someone from a museum involved? Travis called less than a minute later. Margaret let the phone ring until she had saved copies of both messages. Then she answered. What exactly do you think Dad left in there? He asked. I don't know. Then why is the museum coming? To witness the condition. That isn't their business. Connie knew your father's work. What work? Margaret heard the fear beneath his impatience. Travis didn't fear hidden treasure. He feared a fact that might change the value of land he had already begun treating as sold. You'll hear the same information I have when we meet, she said. You're using Dad's name to create a claim. I'm protecting his name from one. Stop talking like this is official. It will be documented. You had no right to involve outsiders. I own the building. If you damage those fixtures, the company will hold you responsible. The bins are mine too. That's your interpretation. It's the wording you asked me to sign. Travis became quiet. Margaret didn't fill the silence for him. I'm coming tomorrow, he said. No, you don't get to keep me off property my father built. Call before you come. Ask to enter. If the answer is no, stay outside. Mom, the floor is safe now. The opening will happen once, with everyone present. She ended the call. A few minutes later, the motion light Arthur had mounted above the shed door sent an alert to her phone. The image showed Travis's truck stopped at the equipment gate. He now knew there was a process he couldn't control, a witness he hadn't chosen, and a date Margaret intended to set without his permission. The truck stayed there for 11 minutes. Travis never left the cab. He backed onto Parker Road, turned toward town, and disappeared. The next morning, Margaret found a folded sheet of paper inside the equipment gate. Travis had placed it beneath a stone to keep it from blowing away. The company was withdrawing permission for vehicles to use the farm track except for removal of recognized company property. The reason given was liability. The ground was wet, repairs were underway without company supervision, and Travis claimed he couldn't accept responsibility for injuries or damage. Arthur read the notice beside his truck. He used Rachel's printer, he said. How can you tell? She centers everything. Margaret folded the page. We can walk in. The lifting frame can't. We already brought the lumber. The chain hoist is at my house. We carry it between us. You carry nothing. Margaret looked across the field. The shed stood less than 200 yards away. The distance wasn't large until every tool had to cross it by hand. He wants us to argue about access, she said. I'm available. No. She called Travis from the gate. He answered quickly. Did you get the notice? I did. Arthur needs to bring his truck to the shed. He can't. The track held the roofing delivery. That was before you started lifting the floor. The work is inside the building. It's a liability issue. Then put your actual concern in writing. I did. No. You put wet ground in writing? Travis was quiet for a moment. Connie Lyons has no business participating in an estate inspection, he said. There's no estate property in question until we find some. You've already decided there is. I've decided to inspect my fixtures. You're making Dad into some kind of museum story. Margaret looked at the shed. I asked Connie to witness the condition, that's all. Then she can come without the museum. The line went silent. Did you call their office? Margaret asked. I called the museum. Yes. What did you tell them? That their acquisition director was involving herself in a family property dispute before ownership was established. There is no ownership dispute over the shed. There will be if you claim Dad's work was hidden there. Margaret gripped the phone with her left hand. You don't know what's there, neither do you. Then why are you trying so hard to control who sees it? I'm protecting the company. From a feed bin? From you turning an old building into a public accusation? The words found their mark. Margaret imagined people in town hearing that she had brought museum staff onto family land because she hoped to prove her children cheated her. She imagined Rachel explaining the dispute to a mortgage lender. She imagined Frank's private work becoming gossip before anyone knew if it existed. Travis knew she hated public disorder. He had grown up watching her close kitchen windows before family arguments. I'm not accusing anyone, she said, then signed the quitclaim. I'll pay the taxes and reimburse the roof. You still haven't given me a written amount. I'll give you $30,000. It was the first clear offer he had made. The amount would pay the taxes, replace the money she had spent, and leave enough for a modest rental. A week earlier, Margaret might have accepted it if he had spoken with respect and allowed her time to inspect the shed. Now the offer told her something else. Travis valued control more than he valued the parcel on his own appraisal. Put it in writing, she said. You'll accept? I'll read it. I need an answer today. No. The developer's review is Monday. There it was. The pressure had a calendar unrelated to county taxes. My answer isn't due Monday, Margaret said. Then don't complain when the offer changes. He ended the call. Arthur had heard only Margaret's side. How much? 30,000? That's not nothing. No. You could take it? Yes. He waited. Margaret placed the folded access notice in her notebook. Bring the chain hoist to the gate. We'll use the handcart. Arthur didn't ask again. They crossed the field with the hoist, 2 lengths of steel pipe, straps, bolts, and a box of tools. It took 3 trips. Margaret pulled the empty handcart back using her left arm. Arthur handled it when loaded. The new restriction cost them most of the morning. Inside the shed, they built a frame over the first feed bin. 2 upright timbers stood on the newly braced floor, with a crossbeam above the lid. Arthur fitted the chain hoist at the center. Margaret checked the frame for square. They did not attach the lifting straps. The bolts remained untouched. At noon, Connie called. Her first words were, I'm sorry. Margaret sat at Frank's bench. What did they say? The museum received a complaint that I was using my position to influence a private estate dispute. Are you? No. But intent isn't the only issue. If the museum might later consider objects connected to the shed, I can't direct the opening or serve as the sole independent witness. You never offered to direct it. I know. Can you still attend? Not as acquisition director. Not until the ownership question is clear. The shed belongs to me. The complaint says contents connected to Frank may belong to the family company. The will says otherwise. I haven't reviewed the will. Margaret looked toward the bins. Travis knew exactly where to press. He raised a legitimate conflict issue in a very useful way. Useful to him. Yes. Connie sounded angry, but she kept her words measured. Her job required that habit. The museum's public trust mattered. Margaret understood why Connie couldn't simply ignore a complaint, because it came from an unreasonable son. What can you do? Margaret asked. I can give you the names of independent conservators. I can provide a personal factual statement about seeing Frank carve. I can also make the 2 study decoys available for comparison later. Under normal museum procedures, you can't witness the bins being lifted, not in my museum role. Could you come as Frank's friend? That would make every later transaction look worse. If the museum ever made an offer, Travis could say, I helped create the evidence I wanted to buy. Margaret rubbed her forehead. She had asked Connie to create distance between the discovery and the family argument. Travis had turned Connie's involvement into another reason to doubt the process. Who would you call? Margaret asked. Pamela Hodges. What does she do? Folk art conservation and attribution work. She's independent. She has examined working decoys for private owners and museums. She doesn't buy them. Would she come before we know there's anything to examine? If you pay for her time? How much? I don't know. She travels from Cape May County. Give her my number. I will. Connie paused. Margaret, don't let this push you into opening the bins alone. I won't. And don't accept museum interest as proof of value. We have a question, not an answer. I understand. After the call, Margaret told Arthur. He tightened a bolt in the lifting frame. Travis removed the witness without touching the lock. He was right about the conflict. That doesn't make him honest about why he raised it. No. What now? We hire someone independent. With what money? Margaret didn't answer. She called Pamela Hodges from the shed. Pamela asked practical questions. Was the space dry? Had any object been removed? Who owned the building? Was there a written description of its contents in the will? Who would attend the opening? Had the museum promised to buy anything? Margaret answered each one. No promise, she said. They don't know what's there. Good, Pamela replied. Hope makes people handle objects badly. Pamela could come the following Thursday. She would witness the condition, advise on removal if anything was found, and prepare a factual examination record. Authentication, if needed, would be separate work after comparison with known objects. Her fee for the day, travel, and written record was $3,200. Half was required to reserve the date. Margaret had enough available money to pay part of it, but not all. The clinic, medicine, rental extension, gravel, lock, and framing hardware had reduced what remained outside the tax reserve. To hire Pamela, Margaret would have to use money set aside for the county. How long can you hold Thursday? She asked. Until 5 today. I'll call back. Margaret ended the call and opened her notebook. The figures didn't improve when written carefully. If she paid Pamela's retainer, she would be short on the taxes. If she reserved the date and later canceled, part of the fee would still be owed. If the compartment proved empty, no museum question would matter. She would have spent money meant to protect the parcel on a professional witness to nothing. Arthur sat across from her. You don't have to open it next week, he said. The county deadline keeps moving. It stays the same. We move toward it. You know what I mean. You can take Travis's offer. Margaret turned the pencil between her fingers. Do you think I should? I think $30,000 would make your next month easier. That wasn't my question. Arthur looked toward the lifting frame. I think Frank built that space for a reason. I don't know whether the reason can pay taxes. Margaret did. The worst part was that accepting Travis's offer would look sensible. She could tell herself the shed had already given her something. It had returned her tools, her workbench, and a few facts about Frank. She could leave the compartment closed and carry those facts away. But the property would then pass to Travis. He could open it privately, remove whatever he found, and decide which parts belonged to the company. Margaret would have no standing inside the room and no record of its contents. She had spent most of her family life trusting that being fair would encourage other people to be fair. That trust had brought her to a kitchen table, where her housing was treated as a detail. The decision before her wasn't whether Travis deserved belief. It was whether the evidence deserved care before anybody owned its story. Margaret called the county office again. She asked what happened if she paid part of the taxes by the deadline and completed the balance shortly afterward. The answer was not comforting. The process would continue, though payment could still be made before a later sales stage. There would be added cost and no guarantee that delay would remain harmless. She wrote down the explanation. Then she called Pamela back. I want Thursday, Margaret said. I'll send the agreement. The opening will include my son, my daughter, Arthur Barnes, and me. Connie Lyons won't direct it. That's appropriate. The fixtures remain closed until you arrive. Good. Margaret transferred the retainer from the account, holding the tax money. The confirmation appeared on her phone. Her county payment was now $1,600 short, with other expenses still coming. She felt the loss immediately. It wasn't a figure on paper anymore. It was a deadline she might fail because she had chosen proof over safety. Margaret sent Travis and Rachel the inspection date, Pamela's name, her independent role, and the rules for entry. She included photographs showing the bolts still in place. Rachel replied that she would attend. Travis sent no answer. Margaret printed the payment confirmation and placed it with the work log. Then she and Arthur removed the chain from the hoist, sealed it in a numbered bag, and locked the lifting straps inside Arthur's tool chest. Nothing could be opened early without leaving a visible change. At the equipment gate, Travis's access notice still rested beneath the stone. Margaret left it there. She carried her empty handcart across the field, knowing exactly what Thursday had cost and why she was going to meet it. The next morning, the estate office called. The same woman who had attended the kitchen meeting spoke in her careful professional voice. Mr. Cole contacted us about the inspection notice. What did he want? He asked whether the office would advise you not to disturb property associated with the family company. And will it? We don't give that kind of instruction. The settlement has been signed. Margaret stood at Irene's kitchen counter with her notebook open. I need the complete property schedule used to prepare it. You received the final schedule. I received the summary. I want the inspection notes and the original asset descriptions. There was a pause while the woman checked the file. You're entitled to copies as a party to the estate. Can I collect them today? Yes. Margaret drove to the office before lunch. Nothing in the reception room had changed since the settlement. The same artificial plant stood beside the same stack of property magazines. Margaret sat beneath a clock that ticked louder than necessary. The woman brought a thick file and led her into a small meeting room. I can explain what's in the record, she said. I can't advise you about a dispute. I'm not asking you to choose a side. The property inspection had been brief, just as Rachel said. It included exterior photographs, rough measurements, and a handwritten description of visible contents. The shed had been valued as a deteriorated outbuilding. The notes mentioned roof failure, disconnected power, moisture damage, and an unsafe west floor. Margaret turned the page. 4 fixed wooden feed bins were listed as permanent fixtures. The wording had been entered by Rachel. Travis had signed the inspection sheet as company manager. Did they have to classify the bins? Margaret asked. They were describing what passed with the building, and this was used to prepare the settlement? Yes. The next page listed possible company property stored inside. 2 scales, poultry trays, and a conveyor motor. Nothing else. Margaret placed her inventory beside the estate notes. The lists matched. Travis says anything connected to Frank may belong to the company. That isn't what this filing says. No. The woman adjusted the file so both could read the final page. Frank's will language appeared in full, followed by the settlement property description Margaret had signed. The shed and every item housed within or beneath its fixtures passed to Margaret. The settlement repeated the wording without reservation, except for separately owned property that could be identified. Does the company own the bins? Margaret asked. The inspection treats them as part of the shed. Could Travis change that now? Not in this office's file. He could make a claim elsewhere, but he would need a basis for it. The woman tapped the company property list. If a tag company motor is in the shed, the will doesn't turn it into personal property merely because it was stored there. The same would be true of Mr. Barnes's tools. But this office has no record of the company claiming unknown contents beneath fixtures, so the wording still controls. The signed wording is still the signed wording. It wasn't a promise that Margaret would win every argument. It was better than that. It was a fact nobody needed to embellish. She requested certified copies of the will clause, the settlement schedule, the inspection sheet, and the company property list. She paid the copying fee and waited while the woman stamped each page. Before Margaret left, the woman said, "Document the opening carefully. I intend to, and if anything is found, don't let people divide it in the room." Margaret looked at her. "Has that happened before?" "I work with families." Outside, Margaret sat in the station wagon and read the pages again. The feed bins were fixtures because Travis and Rachel had called them fixtures when they believed they contained nothing. The clause covering what lay beneath those fixtures had been repeated in the settlement because nobody had considered the words important. That was the leverage, not Connie's interest, not the developer's deadline, not Rachel's private offer. Those facts created pressure, but they didn't decide ownership. The signed clause did, if the contents could be shown to belong to Frank rather than the company or Arthur. Margaret called Pamela. "I have the original estate inspection," she said. "It identifies the bins as permanent fixtures. Bring certified copies tomorrow. The company property list names only the items we already identified. Bring that too. Does it change your work? It changes what must be separated. I'll examine objects and records, not interpret the will. That's what I need." Pamela asked whether all parties had confirmed attendance. Rachel has, Travis hasn't. Send a final notice with the time. State that the opening will proceed if an invited party chooses not to attend. Margaret did. Travis replied with his written offer attached. $30,000 for the parcel, roof improvements included. Acceptance required cancellation of the inspection and transfer of the shed by the following Monday. Margaret printed it and placed it behind the certified estate papers. She didn't sign. Rachel came to Irene's house that evening. She waited on the front step rather than ringing the bell. Margaret found her there when she returned with groceries. "Is Irene home?" Rachel asked. "She's at her sister's." "Good." Margaret unlocked the door. "Come in." Rachel followed her into the kitchen and began putting groceries away without being asked. She placed canned soup above the stove, milk in the refrigerator, and bread in a drawer Irene used for dish towels. "Bread goes on the counter," Margaret said. Rachel moved it. For several minutes they handled ordinary things. Margaret had missed this version of her daughter, the one who knew how to carry 2 bags without crushing the eggs and always checked expiration dates before putting food away. When the last bag was empty, Rachel sat at the table. "Travis showed me the offer. It's clear. You could take it." "Yes." "Will you?" "No." Rachel rubbed her palms together. "Pamela Hodges is expensive." "How do you know?" "I looked her up. I paid her retainer." "With what money?" "My money." "Your tax money?" Margaret closed the refrigerator. "Part of it." "How much are you short?" "Enough to matter. I can replace it." "With another private check?" "If you cancel tomorrow." "No." Rachel's eyes filled, but she blinked before anything fell. "What do you want from us?" "The question isn't about you. It has been about us from the beginning. That's because you keep standing between me and the shed. It's a building. It's the only thing in the settlement anyone expected me to accept without looking." Rachel stood. "You think we planned to leave you with nothing? I think you planned to finish quickly. We were trying to save the company. You were trying to save your mortgage too." Rachel turned toward the window. Margaret could have told Travis about the $6,000 check. She could have shown Pamela the message about Rachel's lender. She could have used her daughter's private fear to split the two of them before the inspection. It would have worked, at least for a while. Travis would question every number Rachel had prepared. Rachel would defend herself by revealing what Travis had promised the developer. Their alliance would break before the bins were touched. Margaret didn't want victory that depended on making her children suspicious of each other. They had managed enough of that without her help. "I'm not going to bring up your check tomorrow," she said. Rachel faced her. "Why not?" "Because it doesn't prove what's beneath the bins. You could use it against me." "Yes." Rachel waited, perhaps expecting comfort after the answer. Margaret gave her none. "If anyone asks me directly, I won't lie," she said. "But I won't use your mortgage to force you onto my side." "Do you think I have a side?" "Everyone has one. You've been calling yours closure." Rachel sat again. After a while, she said, "Travis is scared." "Of what?" "The land sale is holding up 2 contracts. He borrowed against equipment to cover payroll last winter. If the buyer walks, he has to find another way through." Margaret knew Travis was under pressure. She hadn't known the shape of it. "Why didn't he tell me?" "He doesn't want you to think he needs money. He asked me to sign away land, but he doesn't want me to know he needs money. That's Travis." "No. That's a choice Travis keeps making." Rachel looked down at her hands. "What if there are valuable things in there?" she asked. "Then we find out what they are and who owns them. And if the will gives them to you, then they're mine." The sentence altered something between them. Margaret heard it, and Rachel did too. There had always been an unspoken second half to anything Margaret owned. Her tools were hers until Travis needed them. Her time was hers until Rachel had forms to complete. Her house was hers until the company arrangement made another use more convenient. This time, there was no second half. Rachel stood and put on her coat. "I'll be there tomorrow. Thank you." "I'm not saying I agree. I didn't ask you to." At the door, Rachel paused. "If Travis gets angry, don't answer him right away. Let Pamela speak. Pamela won't settle family arguments." "No, but he'll behave better with her there. That's his decision." Rachel left. Thursday morning arrived clear and windless. Arthur brought the chain hoist to the gate on the handcart. Margaret carried the sealed envelope containing the chain. Her shoulder had improved enough for dressing and driving, but she kept the arm close to her body. Pamela arrived first in a dark hatchback with no logo. She carried padded trays, clean paper, gloves, lights, a camera stand, and a folding table. She examined the outside framing before entering. Then she compared the sealed photographs with the current condition. Every bolt remained in place. The floor level hadn't changed. The numbered bag around the hoist chain was intact. Margaret showed her the will clause and inspection sheet. Pamela read both. These tell us how the estate described the building, she said. My record will tell what is physically present and whether objects can be associated with Frank's work. That's enough. Arthur assembled the lifting straps beneath Pamela's camera. Rachel arrived at 9, wearing rubber boots. Travis came 10 minutes later. He parked outside the gate and walked in alone. He carried the written offer in one hand. Margaret unlocked the shed. Before anyone entered, she gave each person a copy of the inspection rules and the certified property schedule. Travis saw his signature beneath the line, identifying the fixed feed bins. He looked at Margaret, then at the clause covering every item housed beneath them. For once, he didn't tell her what the papers meant. Pamela positioned the camera. Arthur hung the sealed chain from the hoist. Rachel stood beside the folding table. Travis remained near the door. Margaret placed the first wrench over the square nut at the base of the nearest iron strap. The nut didn't move. Margaret adjusted the wrench and leaned with her left hand. Rust broke loose in a dry shower. The nut turned 1/8 of an inch. "Stop," Travis said. Pamela looked up from behind the camera. "Is there a safety concern?" "There's an ownership concern." "The fixture hasn't been lifted," Pamela said. "State your concern clearly for the record." Travis held the written offer against his leg. "My father built these bins while he ran the family company. Any tools, records, or equipment connected to his work belonged to that company." Rachel glanced at the inspection sheet in her hand. Margaret said, "You signed that the bins were permanent fixtures of the shed. I signed an inspection prepared for a worthless outbuilding. I didn't agree that Mom could turn Dad's business property into hers." "What business property?" Margaret asked. "Whatever you think is under there. I don't know what's there. You brought a conservator." "Because I don't know." Travis stepped farther inside. "Dad would have told me if there were anything important in this building. I ran the company with him. He gave me the yard and the house because that's where the value was." Rachel said quietly, "The company received the yard. You received the house through the settlement. It's the same operation." "No, it isn't." Travis turned on her. "Whose side are you on?" Pamela raised one hand. "This inspection concerns condition, location, and identity. Family arguments will not help me establish any of those." Travis faced the camera again. "Fine. My position is that anything associated with Dad's work belongs to the company, regardless of where it was stored." Pamela recorded his statement. Margaret removed the first nut. Arthur loosened the matching bolt on the opposite side. They worked in sequence until all 4 fasteners from the first bin were free. The iron strap lifted away, leaving dark lines in the wood where it had rested for years. Arthur passed lifting straps beneath the bin frame. He connected them above the lid and checked the chain hoist. "Clear," he said. Pamela moved everyone behind a chalk line on the floor. Arthur pulled the chain. The bin rose slowly. Its bottom didn't separate from the floor. A fitted wooden platform came up with it, revealing a dark rectangular opening beneath. Rachel took one step forward, then stopped at the chalk line. Travis said nothing. The opening was almost the full width of the bin, and about 21 inches deep. Pine-tarred boards lined the sides. A shallow tray filled the top half of the enclosed space. Arthur secured the hoist. Pamela photographed the opening before anyone approached. Margaret stood beside the raised bin. Travis had lived on that land for most of his life. He had worked within sight of the shed every day for years. Yet he stared into the opening as if the ground had changed beneath him. Pamela fitted gloves over her hands. The first object in the tray was a roll of carving tools wrapped in waxed cloth. Beside it lay 3 unfinished wooden birds. One had only a rough body shape. Another had a finished head without paint. The third was complete except for its eyes. Connie's question returned to Margaret. Bird patterns, carved heads, paint jars, or white cedar. All of them were there. Pamela removed nothing until each object had been photographed in place. She numbered the positions, then lifted the waxed roll onto padded paper. Inside were knives, small gouges, and a narrow rasp. Their handles bore the dark polish of long use. Arthur pointed without crossing the line. "Those were Frank's." "How do you know?" Pamela asked. He shaped his handles flat on one side, said round handles rolled off the bench. Pamela recorded the observation. The tray also held jars of dry pigment, brushes wrapped in paper, and cardboard patterns cut into breast, head, and tail shapes. Frank's initials appeared on several pieces. Travis found his voice. "Those are personal tools. That doesn't mean the company didn't pay for the materials. Margaret looked at him. Let her work. Pamela examined the bottom of the tray. There's another joint. The same open bird beak mark appeared near one corner. Arthur leaned closer. Release side. Pamela lifted a small wooden pin with padded pliers. A second panel moved beneath the tray. The opening continued deeper. Arthur lowered the first bin onto temporary blocks while the tray remained supported. Then they repeated the process with the other 3 bins. Each one lifted a fitted section of floor. Beneath all 4 lay a single sealed compartment. Frank had packed it carefully. Wooden decoys rested in divided racks, each wrapped loosely in unbleached cloth. Some were weathered from use. Others carried paint so clean they seemed recently finished. Heads turned in slightly different directions. Bodies sat low and broad, made for rough bay water rather than a display shelf. There were dozens. Margaret didn't count them. She saw Frank's hands in the shallow cuts along the breasts and the careful shelves beneath the tails. She had seen those movements at the cabinet bench without understanding where else he used them. Along the rear of the compartment stood flat boxes of patterns and photographs. A narrow metal case held notebooks. Pamela opened the first notebook where it lay. Frank's name appeared inside the cover. The first dated entry was from 1998. The pages listed cedar sources, paint mixtures, repairs, birds traded, birds retained, and photographs taken. His writing continued through the years without a large gap. The last notebook contained entries from the year he died. Rachel covered her mouth with one hand. Travis stared at the racks. The written offer slipped from his fingers and landed face down on the floor. Pamela lifted a photograph by its edges. It showed Frank seated at the scarred bench inside the shed. An unfinished bird rested beneath his left hand. Behind him, the fixed bins stood open. Another photograph showed a row of completed decoys on the workbench. Numbers written on their bases matched entries in the ledger. "This is an archive," Pamela said. "Is it Dad's?" Rachel asked. The photographs, tools, and notebooks connect the work to him. Authentication requires comparison, but the internal record is unusually complete. Travis crossed the chalk line. Arthur stepped in front of him. "I want to see the ledger," Travis said. "You'll see it from the table," Pamela replied. "Nobody handles it without gloves. That was my father's book. It was found in a protected compartment beneath a fixture assigned to Margaret. You don't decide ownership. No, I document identity and location." Margaret picked up the written offer from the floor. She placed it on Frank's bench. Travis looked at her. "You knew." "No." Arthur knew. Arthur shook his head. "You brought a museum director out here before you opened it," Travis said. "Somebody told you. Connie told me Frank might have made 2 birds she couldn't identify. She didn't know this was here. This collection came from company lumber." Pamela opened the next ledger volume. Receipts and source notes were attached to several pages. Frank had recorded cedar salvage from Arthur's boat work, wood purchased personally, and blanks received in trade. Nothing in the open pages referred to the farm company. Margaret didn't argue. The record could speak after it was examined. Pamela worked until evening. Every object remained in the shed. The bins stayed raised on secured supports, and the compartment was covered with clean boards before the door was locked. Over the next 3 days, Pamela compared the collection in stages. Connie arranged access to the museum's 2 anonymous study decoys without participating in the ownership decision. Pamela examined them under the same light used for Frank's master birds. She compared cedar grain, tool marks, tail cuts, head patterns, nail placement, and layers of pigment. The ledgers recorded 2 birds traded to men, whose family names matched the histories attached to the museum decoys. Dated photographs showed Frank holding both birds before they left the shed. Pamela returned to the museum comparison twice. On Monday afternoon, she completed her report at the folding table inside the shed. Margaret, Travis, Rachel, Arthur, Connie, and the estate office representative were present. Pamela placed photographs of the 2 museum birds beside photographs from Frank's ledger. "The construction sequence is the same," she said. "The tool marks match the documented tools. Pigment mixtures recorded by Frank correspond to the paint layers on the known birds. The patterns, photographs, and continuous ledger establish a working record from 1998 through the final year of his life." Travis stood with his arms crossed. "Are you saying Dad made the museum birds?" "Yes." "And all of these?" "The master collection is documented individually in his ledger. In my professional opinion, Frank Cole was the carver previously identified as the Barnegat hand. Margaret heard the words without feeling triumph. She looked at the bench where Frank had worked after leaving the farmhouse on cold evenings. He hadn't preserved a pile of valuable objects. He had preserved a way to connect his name to his work when he was no longer there to answer questions. Connie's eyes were wet. She kept her hands folded over her clipboard. The estate representative opened the certified file. The company property list identifies the scales, trays, and conveyor motor, she said. Mr. Barnes's inventory identifies his tools. Those items remain with their owners. She turned to the will clause and the signed property schedule. The feed bins were classified by the estate and the company manager as permanent fixtures. The collection and archive were physically housed beneath those fixtures. Pamela's report identifies them as Frank Cole's personal work and working records. Travis said, "He was company president. That fact doesn't place every personal object he made on the company asset list. I'm making a company claim. On what basis? He used the property. So did Mr. Barnes. Location isn't the only issue. The signed settlement specifically assigns the shed and every item housed within or beneath its fixtures to Margaret Cole, except separately owned property that can be identified. The authenticated collection falls within that clause." Rachel looked at the signature beside her original fixture description. "What happens now?" she asked. "The estate record will identify Margaret as owner of the collection and archive." Travis looked from the representative to Pamela, then to the open bins. A week earlier, he had believed value followed the house, the company yard, and his control. He had believed the shed remained useful only if Margaret surrendered it. Now, the one clause he had treated as harmless placed Frank's life's work beyond his reach. Margaret signed the updated inventory. The representative signed beneath her. Pamela sealed the authenticated ledger in a protective case and handed the case directly to Margaret. Margaret took it with both hands. The case was lighter than she expected. The notebooks inside had changed the ownership of everything around them, yet they weighed less than a kitchen drawer. Travis walked outside before Pamela finished packing. Rachel remained near the folding table. "Is he going to challenge it?" she asked. The estate representative closed the file. "That's a question for him. Today's record is clear. Pamela gave Margaret instructions for humidity, light, handling, and temporary storage. The compartment had protected the collection for years, but now that it was open, conditions would change. The birds couldn't remain beside damp framing or beneath a roof that still needed work on its south slope. "I can arrange proper packing," Connie said. Pamela looked at Margaret. "Only with the owner's permission." Everyone waited. It was a small change, but Margaret felt it. Nobody asked Travis. Nobody looked to Rachel for an account number. The decision remained where it belonged. "Yes," Margaret said. "Pack the birds. The ledgers and working patterns stay here once the room is suitable." Connie nodded. "We can do that." Pamela handed over her completed report, collected the final payment, and left. Her work was finished. She had identified the objects, tied them to Frank, and made no claim on what should happen next. The estate representative left after providing copies of the updated record. Rachel helped remove the folding table. When they were alone near the doorway, she said, "I should have read that clause differently. You read it the way everyone wanted it to work. I thought the shed was a burden. It was. You know what I mean." Margaret did. Rachel wanted the mistake separated from the choice that followed. The building had been a burden. Rachel had still allowed $16,000 in overdue taxes to travel with it while she took the liquid accounts. "I should have told you about the tax bill sooner," Rachel said. "Yes, I'm sorry." Margaret waited. Rachel seemed to expect the apology to finish something. When it didn't, she looked toward the uncovered bins. "What happens to the collection?" "Connie will discuss that with me." "The museum?" "Yes. Travis will think you arranged this from the beginning. He can think what he chooses." Rachel rubbed mud from one boot against the back of the other. "If anyone from my lender asks about the settlement, can we say the property division was agreed without dispute? It was agreed under pressure, but you signed. I did. So it wasn't legally disputed. You're asking me to choose words that hide your part. I'm asking you not to damage my mortgage over a family disagreement." Margaret looked at her daughter. "I won't contact your lender. I won't volunteer private conversations. If someone asks me a direct question, I'll answer it truthfully." Rachel's mouth tightened. "That could cost me the house. It could also never happen. You could promise." "I could. I won't." Rachel picked up her coat. The apology had acknowledged one fact. It had not restored trust, and Margaret would not pretend it had. Before leaving, Rachel stopped beside Frank's bench. "I didn't know he did any of this. Neither did I. I thought you knew everything about Dad. So did I." That answer seemed to reach her in a place the argument hadn't. She left without asking for reassurance. Connie stayed after Arthur locked the compartment. She and Margaret sat on overturned buckets beneath the repaired roof. Connie placed a folder on the bench, but didn't open it immediately. "The museum wants to make an acquisition offer," she said. "Already? We've been looking for the Barnegat hand for years." Pamela's report answered the attribution question. The complete master group answers several others. "Did you know what it might be worth when you first came here?" "I knew a documented collection could matter. I didn't know its size, condition, or completeness." Margaret appreciated the distinction. Connie opened the folder. The museum offered $620,000 for the master collection. The purchase would include the finished birds identified in Frank's ledger. Frank would be publicly credited as the maker previously known as the Barnegat hand. The working archive would remain Margaret's property. The museum asked for research access to the ledgers, patterns, tools, and photographs. It would provide archival storage materials and help establish suitable conditions inside the shed. The unfinished birds would remain with the archive unless Margaret chose to lend them for an exhibit. Margaret read every page. "What happens if I sell the collection and the museum closes someday?" "The agreement requires transfer to another public collection, not private resale." "And Frank's name stays with the birds?" "Yes, not just in the first exhibit, permanently in the records and labels." Margaret looked toward the open cavity. Frank had hidden the birds from damp, theft, hurried sale, and perhaps his own reluctance to explain himself. He had also left Margaret the job of deciding when hiding should end. "I'll accept if the archive stays here," she said. "Not in museum storage. We'll need environmental improvements. I'm repairing the building, then we'll work with the room you make." Arthur had been cleaning mud from the jacks outside. When Margaret told him the offer, he sat down on the threshold. "That's a house," he said. "It's more than one. I meant, you can buy a house. I own one." Arthur looked behind him at the feed shed. "It doesn't have a bathroom. Yet." He smiled. "All right." The acquisition agreement took another week. Connie dealt directly with Margaret. Questions went through her, signatures came from her, and payment went into an account in her name. Margaret used the first cleared funds to pay the full $16,000 in delinquent taxes, including the added charges. She paid Pamela's balance, the roof expenses, the equipment rental, and the clinic bill. She kept receipts for everything. Then she hired a local architect to determine whether the shed could legally become a small, accessible cottage with a conservation workspace. The building needed plumbing, insulation, a new electrical panel, a level entrance, and repairs to the south roof. The money made those things possible. It didn't make them free of choices. The feed bins had to remain because they formed part of Frank's storage system and the history of the shed. Margaret planned to restore them as cabinets for tools and archival supplies. The cavity would receive a sealed access panel, ventilation, and moisture monitoring. Arthur claimed a corner for his green chest. "You have a garage," Margaret said. "My garage has no coffee. This shed has no coffee. It will." Their arrangement was simple. His tools remained his. He could work there when Margaret was present. If the workshop later accepted learners, Arthur would teach safe sharpening and small wooden repairs. Margaret would teach joinery, cabinet restoration, and conservation supports. Nothing was promised beyond what they could physically manage. Travis came 3 days after the museum payment cleared. He called from the equipment gate. Margaret answered from inside the shed. Electricians were replacing the old panel, and the power was off. "I need to talk," he said. "Call before you come." "You did. Can I enter?" Margaret looked at Arthur. He nodded once. "Yes." Travis walked across the field, carrying no papers. Inside, he stood where the shelves had been removed. The restored ledgers were temporarily stored in archival boxes on Frank's bench. The collection itself had gone to the museum for cataloging. "I heard the amount," he said. "From Rachel? People talk, then ask me. Was it 620,000? Yes." He looked toward the bins. "The company needs a short-term loan." "No." "You don't even know the amount." "No." His face hardened. "Dad built that company and left you control of it. He also built what you sold and left it to me." We have payroll, equipment notes, and contracts waiting on the land sale. The buyer reduced his offer after the shed parcel came out. I'm sorry you're under pressure. Are you? Yes. Then help me. I helped you start the business. I kept records, found insurance papers, loaned tools, and made excuses when jobs went wrong. You don't need another favor from me. You need a plan that works without my property. Travis stared at the new electrical cable running along the wall. You're going to live here? Yes, in Dad's shed, in my home. He shook his head. You're enjoying this. Margaret kept her voice level. No, I'm paying electricians. You could save the business and still have more money than you had a month ago. I could give you everything and still have more than I had a month ago. That isn't a reason. What would Dad say? He had a year to put the collection into the company. He didn't. Travis looked toward Frank's bench, but he didn't answer. Margaret walked to the door. I won't lend company money. If you want me to consider buying a piece of equipment at fair value, send a list. No promises. It wasn't rescue. It wasn't punishment. It was a business boundary. Travis went outside. At the threshold, he turned. I shouldn't have said what I said in the kitchen. Margaret waited. I was angry, he added. That explains it. He seemed to want her to complete the rest for him. She didn't. Travis walked back toward the gate. The following morning, Rachel emailed copies of the original tax notices, company correspondence, and every estate invoice she had kept from Margaret. She didn't attach an apology. She wrote that Margaret should have the full record. Margaret saved the files and replied, "Received." It was the first useful action Rachel had taken without asking what it would restore. That afternoon, Margaret and Arthur carried Frank's repaired bench away from the damp wall. They placed it beneath the cleaned window, where daylight reached the work surface. The electricians restored power before they left. Margaret pressed the switch. A single temporary bulb came on above the bench. It hummed once, then steadied. Arthur looked up. Needs a shade. It needs walls that don't show daylight. That too. The architect's plan arrived the next week. Margaret spread it across Frank's bench and held the corners with 4 wooden planes. The cottage would occupy the south half of the shed. It included a small bedroom, an accessible bathroom, a kitchen wall, and a sitting area beside the old window. The north half would remain a workshop. A wide interior opening connected the 2 spaces with a sliding door to control dust. Margaret changed the kitchen layout twice. The architect had placed the sink where it looked balanced on paper. Margaret moved it closer to the refrigerator so she wouldn't have to cross the room carrying a hot pan. She lowered one section of counter and specified drawers instead of deep lower cabinets. Her shoulder improved, but she listened when it objected. Work was supposed to serve the person doing it. The restored feed bins became the center of the workshop plan. Arthur removed the iron straps, cleaned them, and treated the rust. Margaret rebuilt the damaged lids with wood salvaged from her old shelves. They kept every usable board. The first bin received shallow drawers for chisels and carving knives. The second held clamps and measuring tools. The third stored archival paper, gloves, and padded supports. The fourth remained empty until Margaret decided what future work required. The cavity beneath them stayed accessible through fitted floor panels. Moisture sensors and quiet vents protected the archive. Frank's ledgers, photographs, patterns, and unfinished birds returned in archival boxes provided by the museum. Connie brought them herself. She set each box on the clean work table while Margaret checked the inventory. The first exhibit opens in November, Connie said. His name is on it, Frank Cole, Tuckerton Carver, and boat builder. Not anonymous? Not anymore. Connie handed Margaret the final catalog proof. A photograph showed one of Frank's master birds beside a ledger page and a worn carving knife. Margaret read the caption before approving it. No one asked Travis to sign. The first serious rain came before the insulation was finished. It began after midnight and continued through breakfast. Margaret was still staying with Irene, but the moisture alarm in the shed sent a warning to her phone. She called Arthur. "I'm dressed," he said. "You were awake? I am now." They reached the shed within 20 minutes. Rain hammered the metal roof. The repaired north slope held, but water had pooled against the west foundation. Their drainage channel had collapsed where the soft bank met the ditch. One downspout extension had also pulled loose. Water poured beside the cribbing beneath the restored floor. "We rushed the outlet," Arthur said. "We aimed it too steep. Same result." Margaret put on a raincoat. Her shoulder could manage a shovel now, but not for long. Arthur cleared the blocked end while she rebuilt the channel entrance with flat stones. The water rose faster than they could release it. Headlights appeared at the equipment gate. Travis called. "I saw your cars. Do you need the pump?" Margaret looked at the water beneath the shed. "Yes." "Can I bring the truck in?" "Yes." He arrived with a portable pump, hoses, and 2 bags of gravel. He stopped outside the door. "Where do you want it?" Margaret showed him. He set the intake where she pointed and ran the discharge hose toward the ditch. Arthur started the pump. Water began dropping around the foundation. Travis didn't take over. He asked which side of the channel needed gravel, then carried it there. When Margaret told him the downspout needed a gentler angle, he cut a new extension from pipe in his truck. They worked for more than an hour. The floor stayed level. The archive boxes remained dry. One patch of insulation became wet and had to be removed, but no permanent damage occurred. When the rain eased, Travis washed mud from the pump hose. "You should put a proper drain line all the way to the ditch," he said. "I know, I can price it. Send the price in writing." He nodded. "I will." 2 days later, he sent a detailed estimate with labor, materials, and a schedule. The price was fair. Margaret compared it with another quote before hiring him. Travis's crew installed the drainage line. He invoiced her like any other customer. She paid the company, and he sent a receipt. Nothing in that exchange repaired the kitchen meeting. It did establish a way they could stand on the same ground without pretending it hadn't happened. Rachel's repair took a different form. She arrived one Saturday with a binder, a flash drive, and the original estate expense files. "I made you a complete digital copy," she said. "The binder is just an index." Margaret opened it. Rachel had included the tax notices, company reimbursements, Frank's medical expenses, settlement correspondence, and every invoice tied to the shed. She had marked which entries came from her records and which came from Travis. "Did Travis approve this?" Margaret asked. "He doesn't own my files. Why are you giving them to me now? Because I decided you didn't need them. That isn't a reason." Rachel looked toward Frank's bench. "I liked being the person who understood the numbers. When you asked questions, I heard criticism. So I gave you answers without giving you records." Margaret turned one page. "You also wanted the settlement finished." "Yes." "And you let the taxes fall on me." "Yes." Rachel didn't add an excuse. Margaret closed the binder. "I'll keep this." "I thought you should." It wasn't forgiveness. It was an accurate record placed in the hands of the person who should have had it from the start. Rachel began visiting every other Sunday. She didn't organize the workshop unless asked. She brought lunch, sat at the new table, and sometimes helped enter conservation expenses into a spreadsheet Margaret could open herself. Travis came less often. When he did, he called from the gate. The cottage passed its final inspection in early autumn. Margaret moved out of Irene's spare room with the same brown suitcase she had carried from the farmhouse. Arthur rolled it through the new doorway. The entrance had no step now, only a gentle ramp with a handrail. "Bedroom?" he asked. "Leave it by the table. You've been moving into this place for months. I'll unpack when the last cabinet door hangs straight. They're your doors. They've been straight since Tuesday. Then I'll check again." The museum sent its first conservation project soon afterward. 3 working decoys needed stable display supports that would not press against old paint. Margaret designed the supports. Arthur cut the rough pieces. 2 adult woodworkers from town came on Saturday to learn how to shape and pad them. They worked at separate benches beneath bright task lights. Margaret showed them how to use a scraper without lifting fragile grain. Arthur demonstrated sharpening and complained whenever anyone put a chisel down near the edge. At noon, Rachel brought sandwiches. Connie arrived to collect the finished supports and stayed for coffee. She examined each one, signed the work receipt, and dealt with Margaret about the next project. The 4th feed bin began filling with tools donated by retired craftspeople. Margaret accepted only what the workshop could use. Everything was labeled with its owner or source. On the wall beside Frank's photographs hung a simple schedule. Cabinet repair on Tuesdays, conservation work on Thursdays. Open bench on the first Saturday of each month. Nobody under 18 participated. The people who came were adults who wanted steady hands, useful instruction, or a place to work without being rushed. Margaret didn't call it a school. It was a working shop with room for another chair. The first exhibit opened in November. Margaret stood beside Frank's birds while visitors read his name. Arthur stayed near the back of the room. Rachel came alone. Travis arrived late and remained by the doorway until Connie asked him which photographs showed the contracting yard before it was paved. He knew every one. Afterward, Travis asked Margaret whether he could see the ledgers sometime. Yes, she said, at the shed, with clean hands. I know. He came the following Sunday. He sat at Frank's bench and read without turning pages too quickly. When he finished, he placed the first ledger back inside its protective box. I didn't know him this way, he said. Neither did I. Margaret didn't make the moment carry more than it could. Winter brought another hard storm. The permanent drainage line worked. The roof held. Warm air stayed inside the insulated walls, and the moisture monitor remained within range. Arthur called anyway. Any water? None. Roof noise? It's raining. You know what I mean. It's holding. He came the next morning to confirm this for himself. By spring, the pear trees near the track flowered again. Margaret kept the cottage door open on mild afternoons. People called before entering. Tools went back where they belonged. The key remained in her pocket. She finally unpacked the brown suitcase. The framed photograph went on the bedroom shelf. Frank's wool blanket lay folded at the foot of the bed. Margaret stored the suitcase in the cabinet above the closet, empty and out of sight. If stories about reclaiming dignity after family abandonment matter to you, subscribe and return for the next inheritance story. That evening, the last workshop visitor left just before sunset. Margaret washed 2 coffee cups and set them upside down beside the sink. Arthur's green chest was locked in its corner. The archive boxes rested behind fitted doors. A museum work order waited on the clean table for morning. Margaret checked the moisture monitor and closed the lids of the first 3 bins. She left the 4th open because a set of repaired clamps still needed to be put away. Outside, light faded across the wet field. The pear trees moved in a mild wind. No water stood against the foundation. Rachel had gone home after lunch. Travis had called about delivering cedar the following week. Neither had a key. Margaret turned on the lamp above the workbench. She opened the cottage door to the evening air and lowered herself into the chair Arthur had adjusted to the right height. Margaret sat at Frank's repaired bench beside the open cottage door, with the restored feed bins holding her tools and warm lamplight filling the shed.